The Hollingsworth property sat on 11 acres of stony, uneven ground, about 2 miles outside the centre of Dover, in the part of Massachusetts where colonial stone walls still run through the woods in long, purposeless lines, marking the edges of fields that stopped being fields 200 years ago. Thomas had bought the place in 1968, with money from his father and a loan he did not enjoy thinking about. Margaret had wanted a garden. Thomas had wanted quiet. They both got what they asked for, and like most people who get what they ask for, they occasionally wondered whether they had asked for the right thing. They had 2 children. Samuel was 16, all elbows and opinions, in that stage of adolescence where a boy is measuring himself against his father daily and losing by a margin he refuses to acknowledge. Claire was 11, small for her age, with a way of going very still and quiet when adults were talking that made people forget she was in the room. She noticed everything. She said almost none of it out loud. Understanding the family matters, because the story that follows is usually told as a story about a creature. It is not. It is a story about a family that stood in the wrong place at the wrong time and was never allowed to speak about it again. Thomas reached the barn door and stopped. He was a practical man. He had grown up around animals, and he knew what animals sound like when they are frightened, and this was not that. The horses were not panicking. They had gone past panicking into something older and worse. They had frozen. 2 of them stood pressed against the far wall of their stalls with their heads high and their ears flat, and their eyes were rolling white in the beam of his flashlight, and neither of them made a single sound as he came through the door. The chickens in the coop attached to the barn's east side were completely silent. That detail bothered him more than anything else. Chickens are not capable of tactical silence. Chickens are capable of one response to fear, and it is noise. Thomas swept the flashlight beam across the floor. Straw. A tipped water bucket, the spill of it still spreading, still wet at the edges, meaning it had gone over within the last minute or 2. The smell of the barn was the smell it always was. Hay and manure and old wood and the sweet dust of grain. But underneath it was something else. Something faintly sour and mineral, like wet stone, like the inside of a cave, like the smell of a basement after heavy rain. He said, "Hello." He felt ridiculous saying it. He said it anyway because he had convinced himself in the 20 seconds since leaving the house that this would turn out to be a person, a drifter sleeping rough, a teenager on a dare, something with a face and a name and an explanation. Nothing answered. He moved deeper into the barn, past the first stall, past the second, and as he came level with the third, the flashlight beam slid across the gap between the stall partition and the wall, and something moved out of the light, not away from him, out of the light. That was the distinction his mind snagged on and could not let go of, then or ever. It did not flee. It withdrew, smoothly and without panic, the way you would pull your hand back from a stove burner. It moved from where the beam was to where the beam was not, and it did it so fast that Thomas's eyes registered the motion only as a pale smear, a suggestion of something long and thin folding itself into shadow. He swung the light back, and for somewhere between 2 and 4 seconds, depending on which version of the story you hear, and how old Thomas was when he told it, he saw the thing that was in his barn. It was crouched in the corner where the stall partition met the outer wall, folded down into a space that should not have been big enough to hold anything. Its knees were up beside its head, its arms were wrapped around them, and the fingers of those hands were wrong, too long, 4 or 5 inches of finger at least, wrapped around its own shins and overlapping like the legs of a spider gripping a twig. It was perhaps 4 feet tall, though that was a guess because it was folded, and Thomas would say later that unfolding it in his imagination was one of the things that kept him awake. It had no hair, none anywhere. Its skin was the colour of a peeled potato, pale and slightly rough, and in the flashlight beam it looked dry rather than wet, dusty rather than slick. Its body was impossibly thin. He could see the architecture of it. Ribs, the ridge of a spine, the the sharp geometry of a pelvis, all of it laid out under skin with almost nothing between. And its head was too large. That was the detail everyone in this story would eventually agree on. The detail that would be repeated by 4 different witnesses across 4 different nights in 4 different parts of town. The head was disproportionate, bulbous, melon-shaped, one of the teenagers would say. Like a light bulb, another would say. It sat on a neck that seemed far too thin to hold it up, and in that head were the eyes. Thomas Hollingsworth had been a hunter since he was 9 years old. He had shone a light into the eyes of deer, raccoons, foxes, coyotes, barn cats, and once, memorably, a bobcat. He knew exactly what animal eyes do in a flashlight beam. They throw the light back at you in a flat coin of green or gold or red, a mirror behind the retina doing its job. These did that. But they were enormous, and they were round, and they threw the light back orange, and the thing about them that broke something loose in Thomas's chest was that they were looking at him with an expression. Fear. The creature in his barn was terrified of him. He would try to explain that part for the rest of his life, and he would never once get it across the way he wanted to. People wanted the monster story. People wanted teeth and menace and a lunge in the dark. What Thomas had actually experienced in his own barn in the last cold hours of an April night was the sensation of having accidentally cornered something small and clever and frightened, and of standing there in his unlaced boots realizing that he was the large animal in the room, and that whatever this was, it understood that too. It made a sound, not a growl, not a hiss. A soft, rapid series of clicks produced somewhere in the throat, 4 or 5 of them in quick succession, and then a pause, and then 3 more. It had a rhythm to it. It had, Thomas would say later, and immediately regret saying, structure to it. He backed up 1 step. His heel found the tipped water bucket and knocked it, and the metallic scrape of it against the concrete pad was not loud at all, but the creature reacted as though he had fired a shotgun. Its entire body flinched. Its hands came up over the sides of its head, over the places where ears should have been, and it pressed itself flat against the boards, and Thomas understood with sudden and complete clarity that the sound had hurt it. Then it moved. It came out of the corner low and fast on all 4s, but not the way a dog runs or the way a bear runs. It moved like something built wrong for the ground, elbows and knees rising above the line of its back, a scuttling, ratcheting motion that his eyes could not properly track. It went past him at a distance of perhaps 6 feet, close enough that he felt the air of it, close enough that he smelled that wet stone smell again, and it went out through the gap in the barn door and into the blue dark of the yard. Thomas followed. He could not have told you why. He got to the door in time to see it cross the paddock. It went over the 4-foot fence without appearing to jump, more like it flowed up and over, 1 hand on the top rail, and then it was in the tall grass at the edge of the property, and then it was in the tree line, and then it was gone. And in the woods, a moment later, from somewhere back among the pines, came a sound he would hear again. Clicking. Faint. 4 or 5, a pause, then 3 more. And from somewhere much further off, deeper in, so faint he was never sure whether he had actually heard it or invented it in the years afterward, something clicked back. He stood in the yard until the sky went from blue to grey, and then he went inside and made coffee and did not drink it. Margaret found him at the kitchen table at 6:30 with the flashlight still in his hand and the batteries dead. She'd been married to him for 19 years. She did not ask him what was wrong. She sat down across from him and waited, which is a skill, and after a while he told her. He told it badly. He kept circling back to the fingers. Margaret listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, and when he finished, she said the most useful sentence anyone said to him that entire month. She said, "Show me the footprints." Because that was the thing. There were footprints. The paddock had thawed and refrozen and thawed again through March and early April, the way New England ground does, and it had settled into that particular consistency of half mud that takes an impression like modelling clay and then holds it. And leading away from the barn door across the paddock to the fence and then beyond it was a line of tracks. They were roughly 7 inches long. They were narrow. They showed 5 distinct digits, and the digits were long, disproportionately long, extending nearly half the length of the print. There was no claw mark at the tip of any of them. There was a heel, but it was small and set oddly far back, and the weight distribution was strange, deeper at the front as though whatever made them had been moving with most of its mass carried forward. And in 6 places between the barn and the fence, there were handprints beside them. Same length, same 5 long digits. The stride between them was wrong for a person, too long for something 4 feet tall, and the spacing between the hand and foot pairs indicated an animal moving on all 4s at speed. Thomas went and got his camera. It was a Kodak Instamatic, the kind that took the little square cartridge film, and it was not a good camera, and he burned an entire cartridge on those prints. 12 exposures. He put a wooden ruler down beside them for scale in most of the shots, because even in that state he was the kind of man who thought about scale. Then he made his mistake. He called the police. You have to understand what a reasonable decision that was. This was 1977. This was a man in a wealthy, sleepy, extremely well-behaved Massachusetts town, where the police department had, in the previous calendar year, dealt primarily with traffic complaints, a small number of teenage drinking incidents, and a lost dog situation that had escalated further than anyone anticipated. Thomas Hollingsworth had a trespasser. He had property damage. He had evidence. He called the appropriate authority and reported the facts as he understood them, and the officer who took the call was polite and mildly amused and said someone would come out in the afternoon. Nobody came out in the afternoon. At 4:40 in the afternoon, 2 men arrived in a beige sedan. They were not police. They wore civilian clothes, grey slacks and windbreakers, and they carried a leather case between them. They identified themselves as representatives of the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and they produced identification, which Thomas looked at without really reading because he was already relieved that someone had shown up. The older one was perhaps 50, heavy-set, with a flat New England accent that Thomas placed somewhere north of Boston. He said his name was Doyle. The younger man never gave a name at all. He was maybe 35, narrow, with the specific stillness of a person who has been trained to hold still. Doyle said they had been notified about a possible rabid animal incident and asked to see the site. Thomas walked them out to the paddock, and what happened next was the thing that turned this from a strange night into the rest of Thomas Hollingsworth's life. They did not laugh, not a chuckle, not a raised eyebrow, not a single one of the small social gestures that a reasonable adult makes when a farmer walks them across a wet field to show them a footprint that could not possibly belong to any known animal. Doyle crouched over the first print, and the younger man walked ahead along the track line without being told to. Neither of them said anything at all for almost 2 full minutes. Then Doyle took a folding ruler from his pocket, laid it beside the print and read the measurement aloud to the younger man, who wrote it down. Then he said, "Stride length." The younger man paced it out and gave a number. Then Doyle said, quietly, "To nobody in particular, it is moving faster than the last one." Thomas said, "The last one." And Doyle stood up and smiled and said, "The last rabid raccoon we measured." And he said it so smoothly and so pleasantly that Thomas almost believed it. And then he watched Doyle's eyes go past his shoulder to the tree line and stay there half a second too long. They took casts. That was the other thing. They had plaster in the leather case, already mixed proportioned in a sealed container, and they took 3 casts of the best prints. Doyle explained that the department did this routinely, for potential rabies vectors. Thomas, who had lived in Massachusetts his entire life, and had never once heard of a state health inspector arriving with pre-measured casting plaster, said that made sense. The younger man photographed the prints with a camera that was very obviously not a Kodak Instamatic. And then, before they left, standing beside the beige sedan with the driver's door already open, Doyle turned around and asked Thomas a question, in the same easy, pleasant tone he had used about the raccoons. He said, "When you saw it, did it look directly at you?" Thomas said yes. And something happened in Doyle's face. It was not fear, exactly. It was closer to the expression of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the result of. He held Thomas's gaze for a beat, and then he said, "If anything comes back onto this property, do not approach it. Do not shine a light on it. Do not make a loud noise near it. Call this number." He wrote a number on the back of a business card. The card was blank on the front. Thomas noticed this and said nothing. Doyle said one more thing before he got in the car. He said, "You have children." It was not a question. He had not been told. The beige sedan pulled out of the driveway at 10 minutes past 5 and turned left, away from town toward the state forest. At approximately 9 o'clock that night, Samuel Hollingsworth, lying in his bedroom with the window cracked because he liked the cold, counted 11 vehicles going past on the road. Their property was on a dead-end road. On a normal night, the count was 0. He watched the last 4 from the window. They were driving without headlights. For the next 3 days, nothing happened. That is not quite true. For the next 3 days, nothing happened that the Hollingsworths could point to, which is a different thing entirely, and worse. The dog would not go into the woods. Rusty was a 6-year-old mixed breed with the disposition of a golden retriever, and the impulse control of a squirrel, and he had spent his entire life crashing through that tree line after anything that moved. And now he stood at the edge of the lawn with his tail low and his weight on his back legs and would not cross. Claire tried 3 times to coax him. He whined and looked at her and did not move. The horses would not settle. The chickens stopped laying, which happens for a dozen ordinary reasons, but it happened that week. And on 2 separate nights, Margaret heard clicking from the direction of the stone wall. Then came the night of April 21st, 1977. Here is where the fiction steps back and the record steps forward. Because what happened that night happened to real people, and they are entitled to have it told straight. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, 3 teenage boys were driving on Farm Street in Dover. William Bartlett, 17 years old, was behind the wheel. 2 friends were with him. It was a completely ordinary night. They were doing what teenagers in quiet, wealthy towns have always done, which is drive around a place where nothing happens looking for the place where something might. The headlights swept across a low stone wall on the left side of the road, and something was on it. Bartlett saw it for a handful of seconds at a distance he later estimated at about 20 feet. What he described was this: a figure roughly 4 feet tall, standing or crouching on the wall, gripping the stones with its hands and feet, hairless, skin that he described as being like wet sandpaper, and the colour, he said, of a peach. Not pink, not grey. That specific pale orange cream, thin body, thin spindly limbs, long fingers gripping the top of the wall, and an oversized head, shaped, he said, like a watermelon sitting on a thin neck. It had no nose that he could see, no ears, no mouth that he could make out. But it had eyes, and the eyes were large and round, and in the headlights they glowed orange. It turned its head toward the car. Bartlett kept driving. He would say later that he did not consciously decide to keep driving, that his hands simply did not stop. When he got to a friend's house, he was, by the account of everyone who saw him, badly shaken, and he did something that is, honestly, the single most compelling detail in the entire Dover Demon case. He drew it, right there, that night, before anyone had a chance to suggest what it should look like. A simple sketch, in pen, of a thin figure, with a huge round head and long fingers standing on a wall, and beside the drawing he wrote a line that has outlived him in the folklore of this country. He wrote that he had seen this creature, and that it looked at him. 2 hours later, roughly a mile away, a 15-year-old boy named John Baxter was walking home along Miller Hill Road. He saw a figure approaching him in the dark and assumed, reasonably, that it was another kid from town. He called out. The figure did not answer. It stopped. Baxter kept walking toward it, and it turned and ran off the road, down a shallow gully and up the far bank. He followed, because he was 15, and because at 15 the part of your brain that says do not follow the thing into the gully has not fully arrived yet. At the bottom of the gully he looked up the far slope. And there, standing against a tree perhaps 30 feet away, was the same creature. Thin, hairless, enormous head, long fingers, and Baxter added a detail Bartlett had not, which is that the creature's feet were wrapped around the base of the tree, the toes curled around it, gripping it the way a hand would. They looked at each other. Then John Baxter walked backward out of that gully without ever turning around, and when he reached the road he ran. He drew it too, independently. His sketch and Bartlett's sketch, made by two boys who had not spoken to each other, show the same creature. And the following night, April 22nd, a 15-year-old girl named Abby Brabham was being driven home by an 18-year-old friend along Springdale Avenue. She saw a figure on the left side of the road, crouched facing the car, with a large head and glowing eyes. She thought at first it was a dog or a monkey. It was neither. Her description matched the boys' descriptions in nearly every particular, except the colour of the eyes, which she recalled as green rather than orange. 3 sightings, 4 witnesses, 2 nights, all within about 2 miles of each other, in a town of roughly 5,000 people, where nothing like this had ever been reported before, and in the nearly 50 years since has never been reported again. The case was investigated initially by local police, then by cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, who gave the creature the name that stuck, the Dover demon. No explanation has ever satisfied everyone. A foal, a moose calf, an escaped exotic pet, a hoax by clever teenagers who somehow maintained it for decades without one of them ever cracking. Each explanation solves part of the case and breaks against another part of it, which is the fundamental problem with the Dover demon, and the reason it is still being talked about half a century later, now. On the morning of April 22nd, Thomas Hollingsworth opened the newspaper at his kitchen table and read a small item about local teenagers reporting a strange animal on Farm Street. He read it twice. He read the description twice more. Then he got up and went out to the barn and stood in the doorway looking at the corner where the stall partition met the wall, and he understood 2 things at once. The first was that he was not losing his mind, which was, for a moment, an enormous relief. The second arrived immediately behind it and stayed much longer. If 4 separate people had seen it in 4 separate places over 2 nights, spread across 2 miles of town, then it was not lost. It was searching for something. Samuel Hollingsworth was 16 years old, and he had spent 3 days watching his father not sleep. That is the thing that made him do it. Not curiosity, though there was plenty of that. It was watching a man he had always regarded as fundamentally unshakable become a person who checked the door locks twice and stood at windows. So on the night of April 23rd, when the 4th unmarked vehicle in 2 hours went past the end of their road with its headlights off, Samuel took his bicycle out of the shed, carried it 50 yards down the driveway so his parents would not hear the tyres on the gravel, and followed it. He knew the woods. That was his advantage, and it was a real one. He knew that the road curved north for 3/4 of a mile, and then hooked hard east around a bog, and that a fire road cut straight across the neck of that hook, and that if you were willing to carry a bicycle over a fallen oak, you could beat a car to the other side of it. He beat the car to the other side of it. He watched the taillights pass and turn off onto a logging track that ran up toward the higher ground east of the reservoir, and then he walked his bicycle into the trees, laid it down in the leaf litter, and went the rest of the way on foot with his hands out in front of him in the dark. He came over the rise and stopped. There was a clearing below him where the loggers had staged equipment years before, an acre of flat, weedy ground. And in it, in 1977, in a town where the biggest municipal expense that year was road salt, there was a military installation, 2 olive green trucks, 3 unmarked sedans, a generator running low and steady behind a sound baffle, 2 portable light towers pointed down and inward, not out, so that the whole thing glowed from the inside like a lantern and threw almost nothing up into the sky. A canvas tent, large, with the flaps tied back, and at least 14 people, half of them in plain clothes, half of them in grey coveralls, and 4 of them carrying rifles. Samuel lay down on his stomach in the wet leaves at the top of the rise and watched for a long time. He was a 16-year-old boy in a hooded sweatshirt 300 feet from armed federal personnel, and he understood dimly that this was a bad idea, and he stayed anyway. Here is what he was able to make out. There was a map. It was pinned to a board inside the tent, and it was a topographical map of Dover and the surrounding towns, and it was covered in pins. He counted at least 20. They were not scattered randomly. They ran in a rough line southwest to northeast, and the line passed within a quarter-mile of the Hollingsworth property. There was a second board beside it with photographs, and there was a table with radio equipment on it, and a man sitting at the table wearing headphones, and every so often that man would raise his hand and everyone in the clearing would stop moving and go silent, and then after 10 or 20 seconds he would lower his hand and everyone would start again. They were listening for something. Samuel worked his way down the slope. He would say, decades later, that he could not reconstruct the reasoning that led him to move closer, and that he suspected there had not been any. He got to within about 40 feet, behind the trunk of a fallen pine and a screen of young birch, and from there he could see into the tent properly. The photographs on the second board were black and white and grainy, the kind produced by a long lens in poor light. Most showed terrain, rock outcroppings, a culvert, the dark mouth of what might have been a drainage pipe or might have been something older. But one of them, pinned in the centre, was a photograph of the creature. It was standing upright. That was the thing that struck Samuel and stayed with him. Everyone who saw it in Dover saw it crouched or clinging or scrambling, but in this photograph it was standing on two legs with its arms at its sides, and standing, it was unmistakably built on the same blueprint as a person. 2 arms, 2 legs, shoulders, a neck, the head enormous and smooth, the eyes enormous and dark, the hands hanging almost to the knees. It was standing in a corner, and the corner had tiled walls, and there was a drain in the floor. It had not been photographed in the woods. It had been photographed indoors. Above the photographs, printed on a strip of card and pinned across the top of the board, were 2 lines. The first line read, Night Harvest. The second line read, Recovery Priority, Subject 4. Samuel read those words 4 or 5 times before his brain would take them apart properly. And when it did, the conclusion assembled itself with a horrible mechanical simplicity. You do not use the word recovery for something you have never had. Recovery is a word for property. It is a word for something misplaced, something owed, something that belongs to you and is currently somewhere else. The men in that clearing were not scientists studying an unknown animal. They were not hunters tracking a dangerous beast. They were a retrieval operation. Whatever was moving through the woods of Dover, Massachusetts in April of 1977, these men had lost it. Somebody in the tent said something Samuel could not hear, and a man crossed in front of the light towers, and Samuel put his face down into the leaves and did not move for 4 minutes. When he looked up again, the man at the radio table had his hand in the air. The whole clearing had gone still. 14 people standing motionless under the lights, not one of them speaking, and the only sound in the woods was the low churn of the generator. And then, from somewhere to the northeast, out in the dark, faint but perfectly clear across the cold air, came a sound. Clicking. 4 or 5, a pause, then 3 more. Every head in the clearing turned toward it, and the man at the radio table said, loud enough for Samuel to hear it perfectly, 1 word. He said, again, which meant they had heard it before. Samuel Hollingsworth crawled backward up that slope on his elbows, found his bicycle, and rode home in the dark without lights, and when he came into the kitchen at 1:30 in the morning, his father was sitting at the table with the lamp off. Thomas did not shout at him. He listened to the entire account, all of it, the trucks, the map, the pins, the photograph, the words on the card, and then Thomas said the thing that changed the direction of this story. He said, they asked me if it looked at me. Samuel said, so, and Thomas said they did not ask me what it looked like. They already knew what it looked like. They wanted to know whether it had seen my face. Thomas Hollingsworth spent the next 2 days doing something that was, by the standards of 1977, remarkably clever, and by the standards of any era, extremely dangerous. He went looking for the beige sedan. He did not go back to the clearing. He was not a stupid man, and he had no intention of walking his family into a rifle. Instead, he drove into town every morning, and he sat in the parking lot of the general store with a newspaper, and he watched the road, and he wrote down license plates. On the second morning, he got what he wanted. A grey station wagon came through town at 7:40 in the morning and turned onto the road toward the state forest, and it came back out at 6:10 that evening, and at 7:15 it was parked outside a motel on Route 1 in Dedham, 11 miles away, along with 2 sedans and a panel van. Thomas parked across the road and waited. At 9:15, a woman came out of one of the rooms and walked to the ice machine at the end of the building. She was perhaps 45. She wore a cardigan over a blouse and a skirt, and she had the specific exhaustion of a person who has been awake for a very long time, in service of something she does not enjoy. She had a room key on a plastic diamond in one hand, and a paper bucket in the other, and clipped to the cardigan, forgotten, still hanging there because she had stopped noticing it days ago, was an identification badge. Thomas got out of his truck and crossed the road. He said, "My name is Thomas Hollingsworth. I own the farm on Wilson Hollow Road. Something came into my barn on the 18th, and your people took casts of its footprints and asked me if it had seen my face, and I would like to know what it is, because I have an 11-year-old daughter who sleeps 40 feet from the woods." The woman stood very still with the ice bucket in her hand, and then she said quietly, "Oh, hell." Her name was Dr. Lenora Whitcomb. She had a doctorate in comparative anatomy from a university she declined to name, and she had been employed, in one capacity or another, by programs that did not appear in any public budget line since 1959. She did not invite him into her room. They sat in his truck in the motel parking lot with the windows down and the engine off, and she told him the first version of the story, which was the lie. The lie went like this. There was a federally funded biological research facility approximately 9 miles from his property. It studied animal physiology in support of aerospace medicine. An animal had escaped. A primate, an unusual specimen, valuable and difficult to replace. It was not dangerous. It was frightened. Recovery teams were in the field. The matter would be resolved within a week, and there was nothing on his property that would harm his family. Thomas listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then he said, "What primate?" Whitcomb said, "That is classified." Thomas said, "I have hunted every animal in this state. I have seen bears and bobcat and coyote, and I once watched a fisher take a cat off a porch rail. That thing in my barn went over a 4-foot fence with one hand, and it did not use its shoulders to do it. What primate?" And Whitcomb did not answer. So Thomas said the other thing. He said, "When it looked at me, it was afraid, not of the light, of me. It knew what I was. It knew I was bigger than it, and it knew what that meant, and it made a decision, and it went out the door, and I have looked into the eyes of a lot of animals, Doctor, and I have never in my life had one of them do arithmetic at me." Lenora Whitcomb sat in the passenger seat of a Ford pickup in a motel parking lot on Route 1 and put her hands over her face. And then she said, "If I tell you, you cannot unknow it. And they will find out that you know. They always find out." Thomas said, "Tell me anyway." The program was called Project MORPHEUS. It had been established in 1961 under a research authorization that, on paper, funded studies of human adaptation to extreme environments. That was not entirely a lie, which is how the best classified programs work. The stated objective was real and defensible. Soldiers were going to have to operate in the dark, underground, in caves, in tunnels, in the deep cold, in the sealed steel corridors of submarines and missile silos. The human animal is spectacularly badly designed for all of those places. We are a species built for open grassland in daylight. Everything we have achieved underground and after dark, we have achieved by carrying our sunlight with us in batteries. The stated question of Project Morpheus was simple. Could that be changed? Not with equipment, with biology. Could a human being be made to see in near total darkness? Could a human being be made to hear the difference between a rock face and an open passage at 100 feet in absolute black? Could a human being be made to require less food, less oxygen, less warmth? Could you build a person who could live in a place where a person cannot live? In 1961, that was science fiction. There was no mechanism to attempt it. Nobody had the tools. The structure of DNA had been described only 8 years earlier. The program should have been a paper exercise, a few $1 million of literature review, and a quiet cancellation. Instead, in March of 1963, Project Morpheus acquired a mechanism. Whitcomb stopped talking at that point. She sat in the truck in the dark, and Thomas could hear her breathing. He said, "What happened in March of 1963?" And she said, "They were digging." The site was supposed to be a hardened communications relay. That was the cover story in the file, and it may even have been true when the project began. Cold War New England is full of concrete that was poured for reasons nobody will explain. Ventilation shafts in the middle of nowhere, doors set into hillsides, service roads that go half a mile and end at a fence. The excavation was in bedrock. Eastern Massachusetts sits on some of the oldest and most stubborn stone on the continent, and the crews were working with explosives and heavy machinery, cutting a chamber 60 feet down. On the 14th of March, 1963, a charge went off and the floor of the excavation dropped 4 feet. They had cut into a void. The initial assumption was a natural cave, which would have been unusual in that geology, but not impossible. A survey team went down on ropes with lamps and a gas meter. What they found was a chamber roughly the size of a school gymnasium, with a floor of packed sediment and a ceiling of raw stone. The air in it was breathable and slightly cool and smelled of wet mineral. There was no natural entrance visible. There were 3 passages leading out of it, and all 3 had been deliberately narrowed with stacked stone. Not natural formations, stacked, fitted, arranged. In the sediment of that floor they found tools, simple ones, worked stone but not in any tradition anyone recognised, and Whitcomb was careful about this part because she had seen the reports. The lithic technology did not match the archaic period assemblages known from the region. It did not match anything. The flaking pattern was described in one memorandum as consistent with manufacture by a hand with an unusual grip geometry. They found charcoal. They found bones, animal bones, deer and beaver and fish, cracked lengthwise for the marrow. They found symbols scratched into one wall, 40 or 50 of them, in rows. And in the deepest part of the chamber, in a smaller alcove behind a partially collapsed wall of stacked stone, they found 2 bodies. One was ancient. It was skeletal, partially mineralised, and it was the reason nobody in the room slept properly again. It was humanoid. It was small, an estimated 4 feet 2 inches in life. The skull was enormous relative to the frame, with orbital sockets so large they nearly met at the midline. The finger bones were extraordinarily long. The inner ear structures, when they were eventually examined, were larger and more complex than any known hominin. And the second one was alive. Whitcomb said that part flatly, in the truck, in the dark, and then she said nothing for a while. It was found curled in the back of the alcove in a state that the first report called torpor, and the later reports called something else entirely, a metabolic suspension with no clear analogue in mammalian biology. Its body temperature was 11 degrees below what should have been survivable. Its heart rate was 4 beats per minute. When the lamps came on, it opened its eyes. 6 men went down into that chamber on the 14th of March. Whitcomb had read all 6 statements. She said that the thing all 6 of them described, in 6 different vocabularies, was not fear. It was recognition. Every single one of them wrote some version of the same sentence, which was that it looked at them the way a person looks at people. They took it out on a stretcher at 4 in the morning. The excavation was abandoned within 72 hours. The official record shows a geological instability finding. The passages out of the chamber were surveyed to a distance of about 200 feet and then sealed with concrete, and the reason given for sealing them, in the one document Whitcomb had seen with her own eyes, was not structural. The reason given was that survey personnel reported sustained acoustic activity from the unexplored sections. The specimen was designated Source 0. It did not die. That was the first surprise. It was a wild animal, if it was an animal, taken from a stable environment into fluorescent light and stainless steel, and by every reasonable expectation, it should have been dead in a month of stress or infection or simple refusal to eat. Instead, it adapted. It ate what it was given. It learned the schedule of the facility. Within 2 years, the behavioural logs stop using the word specimen consistently and start slipping over and over into the word he. The physiology was extraordinary. The eyes had a reflective layer behind the retina, a tapetum lucidum, which no primate has. The rod density was off the scale of anything measured in a mammal. The auditory range extended far below and far above human hearing, and the creature could locate a dripping pipe on the far side of a concrete wall. Its metabolic requirement was roughly 1/3 of a human being's at the same body mass, and it was genetically related to us, closely. Whitcomb would not give a number, and Thomas did not know enough to ask for one, but she said the word cousin, and she said it with something in her voice that was not entirely scientific. Not an alien, not a demon, a relative. A branch of the human family that had gone down into the dark somewhere in the deep past and stayed there, and had gone on becoming something else while our branch stayed up in the light and became us. Thomas said, "How long?" Whitcomb said, "The material in that chamber has been carbon dated, and I have seen the numbers, and I am not going to say them out loud in a truck." And then she said, "They were not hiding from us in 1963. Do you understand that? That chamber was sealed from the inside a very long time ago. They were hiding from something, and it was not us because we were not here yet." Here is the part of the story where a program that had accidentally made the discovery of the century decided to do something with it. Because that is what happened. Project Morpheus had been chartered to make human beings function underground and in darkness, and in March of 1963, a demolition crew handed it a living, breathing, fully realised example of exactly that. Every problem the program had been established to solve had already been solved, 60 feet down, by something with our bone structure in our hands and our capacity to sit in the dark and scratch symbols on a wall. The correct response would have been decades of careful study and eventual humbling publication. What actually happened was a research directive dated November of 1965, and the directive asked whether the traits could be transferred. Not the whole organism. Nobody was proposing to build a creature. The language of the program was always about traits, discrete and useful and separable. Enhanced low-light vision, auditory sensitivity in the subaudible range, reduced metabolic load, tolerance for low oxygen environments, cold tolerance, the ability to work indefinitely in a place with no sun. You have to imagine what that looked like on paper to a certain kind of person in a certain kind of office in 1965. Not a monster. A soldier who does not need a flashlight. A submariner who does not need as much oxygen. A crew who could survive in a hardened bunker for years after the surface stopped being survivable, which, in 1965, a great many serious people considered a live planning scenario. Whitcomb told Thomas that she had joined the program in 1971 and that by then the work was well underway, and that she had told herself for 6 years that she was a biologist, and that biologists study things. There were, at the time she was speaking, in April of 1977, 12 containment chambers in the facility. Thomas asked the question. Of course he asked it. He said, "What was in them?" And Whitcomb said, "The program produced viable subjects beginning in 1969. That was the entire answer. Thomas asked it 3 more ways over the following 20 minutes and never got a better one, and eventually he stopped asking, because he had worked out that she was not refusing to answer. She was refusing to say it in a sentence with a subject and a verb, because saying it that way would have required her to be a person who had done it. The 4th viable subject was designated with the programme's characteristic poverty of imagination, Subject 4. It was, in Whitcomb's phrasing, partially derived. It had the eyes, it had the ears, it had the metabolic profile, and the pale, hairless, dry skin, and the elongated digits, and the disproportionate cranium that came with the neurological load of processing that much sensory input. It was approximately 4 feet tall at full extension, and it weighed 38 pounds. It was 7 years old. Thomas got out of the truck at that point and stood in the parking lot with his hands on the hood. And it is worth stopping here, at the halfway point of this story, to sit with the thing that makes this particular conspiracy theory work as horror, which is that it does not require you to believe in anything supernatural at all. You do not have to believe in demons. You do not have to believe in visitors from another world. You only have to believe that a government in the middle of the Cold War, having found something extraordinary in a hole in the ground, would try to use it, and would classify what it did, and would keep doing it long after any of the people involved could remember a reason that was not simply momentum. And every part of that, unfortunately, is very easy to believe. So the creature that 4 teenagers and 1 farmer saw in the woods of Dover, Massachusetts, in April of 1977, was not an alien, and was not a cryptid, and was not a demon. It was a child, made in a building, out of pieces of us and pieces of something older than us. And it was out in the cold, in a town it did not know, in the dark that it had been designed for, and it was running. The question Thomas asked next was the right one. He said, "Why did it run?" Whitcomb told him about the signal. It had started as an anomaly in 1974. Source Zero, who had been in the facility for 11 years by then, and had settled into a routine so regular that the behavioural team had stopped taking hourly notes, began on certain nights to behave strangely. He would stop eating. He would move to the eastern wall of his enclosure and press the side of his head against it and remain there, motionless, for hours. It was correlated eventually with seismic data, and then with geophone arrays, and then with a dedicated instrument program that ate a significant portion of the budget for 2 years and was never satisfactorily explained. There was a signal in the bedrock, low frequency, well below human hearing, in the range of 2 to 6 cycles per second. It was intermittent. It was not correlated with tides, traffic, quarry blasting, weather, or any known industrial source. It appeared in a broad arc across eastern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire, and its apparent focus, as far as the arrays could triangulate anything that diffuse, moved. And it had structure. 4 or 5 pulses, a pause, then 3 more. Whitcomb said, "We do not know what it is. I want to be honest about that, because everything else I have told you tonight is documented and that part is not. We know it exists. We know he responds to it. We know that on the nights it is strongest, he does not sleep, and he does not eat, and he presses his head against the wall. And we know that when we play it back to him at low volume, he becomes, and this is the word in the log, distressed. On the 9th of April, 1977, in the course of a routine sensory response protocol, the signal was played to Subject 4 for the first time. The log entry for that session is 4 lines long. Whitcomb had it memorised. Subject exhibited immediate agitation. Subject vocalised continuously for 11 minutes, a clicking vocalisation not previously recorded in this subject. Subject attempted to remove the acoustic sensor from the chamber wall. Session terminated at subject's request. Thomas said, "At whose request?" Whitcomb said, "That is what it says." Subject 4 escaped containment 9 days later, on the evening of the 17th of April 1977. It got out through a ventilation return, into a service corridor, and out through a loading bay whose door was open because a delivery truck was being unloaded. Nobody saw it leave. The facility's outer perimeter was designed to keep people out, not to keep something 38 pounds and built for the dark inside. And the recovery teams that flooded into the woods that week were not, whatever their maps said, searching randomly. They were searching along the arc of the signal, because Lenora Whitcomb had worked out something that she had not put in a report, and she said it to Thomas Hollingsworth in a motel parking lot on Route 1 at 11:30 at night. She said, "It is not running away from us. If it were running away from us, it would have gone west into the state forest and we would never have found it. It went east. It has stayed inside a 3-mile circle for 6 days in a town full of houses and dogs and headlights, and it keeps coming back to the same 1/4 mile of ground." She said, "It is not escaping. It is going somewhere." And Thomas Hollingsworth, standing in the dark with his hands on the hood of his own truck, thought about the 3-mile circle and about the map in the tent with the line of pins running southwest to northeast, and about the fact that his own barn sat almost exactly in the middle of it. Claire Hollingsworth had not told anyone about the clicking. She was 11 years old and she had spent her whole life being the smallest person in every room, and she had developed the particular strategy that small people develop, which is to notice everything and volunteer nothing. She had heard the clicking on the night of the 18th, before her father ever went down to the barn. She had heard it again on the 20th and the 21st, and on the night of the 22nd she had knelt on her bed with her chin on the windowsill and the window open 2 inches, and she had done something no adult in this story ever thought to do. She had clicked back, 4 with her tongue against the roof of her mouth, a pause, then 3. And out at the stone wall, in the dark under the pines, something answered her. They did this for 4 nights. Claire would say later that it was not frightening, and that this was the part nobody believed. She said it was like the game you play with a bird outside a window, where you make a sound and it makes a sound, and neither of you knows what the other one means, but you both know you're doing it on purpose. On the 4th night she saw it. It was standing at the edge of the lawn, about 40 feet from the house, in the grey light of a half moon. It did not come closer. It stood there for perhaps a minute with its long hands hanging at its sides and its enormous head turned toward her window, and then it lifted one hand and it clicked. 4 and a pause and 3, and it turned and walked toward the stone wall and stopped and looked back at her. And then it did it again, walked a few paces, stopped, looked back. Claire was 11, but she had a dog, and she had known that. Dog since she was 5, and she knew perfectly well what an animal is doing when it walks away from you and stops and looks back. It was asking her to follow. She did not go that night. She wanted to. She lay in bed with her heart going, and she did not go. And she has said since that she does not know why she stayed, and that if she had been 12 instead of 11, she probably would not have. She went the next night. Margaret found the bed empty at 4:20 in the morning on the 27th of April. What followed was the worst hour of Thomas Hollingsworth's life, and it is worth saying plainly, because in the middle of a story about tunnels and programs and classified biology, it is easy to lose the fact that this was a man in a field at 4 in the morning shouting his daughter's name at a tree line. They found her footprints in the soft ground past the paddock, bare feet. She had gone out in a nightgown and a coat and no shoes, and there is something about the smallness of a barefoot print in cold mud that Margaret Hollingsworth never got over. And beside them, matching her stride, sometimes ahead of her and sometimes behind, were the other prints. 7 inches, 5 long digits, no claw. Thomas went into the woods with a lantern and the rifle he had not taken on the 18th. Samuel went with him, and behind them, before they had gone 400 yards, headlights came up the road, and doors opened, and men came into the woods behind them with radios and with rifles of their own, because whatever else those men were doing in Dover that spring, they were listening to that farmhouse. The old quarry was 1.5 miles northeast of the property. It had not been worked since the 1920s. It was a stepped granite pit maybe 80 feet across with a black pool of groundwater at the bottom, and birch trees growing out of the ledges, the kind of place every kid in every New England town knows about and every parent forbids. Thomas came out of the trees at the western rim just as the sky was beginning to go grey. And there, on the second ledge down, sitting cross-legged in her nightgown and her coat with her bare feet tucked under her, was his daughter. She was fine. That is the first thing he registered, and the only thing that mattered for several seconds. She was cold, and she was filthy to the knees, and she was entirely, completely unharmed. And sitting beside her, about 4 feet away, with its knees drawn up and its long fingers wrapped around its shins, was Subject 4. Nobody moved. Thomas stood at the rim with the lantern in one hand and the rifle in the other, and he understood that if he raised either of them, this would end badly, and that his daughter was between the two of them. Claire looked up at him and said, in the flat and slightly exasperated tone of an 11-year-old who has been caught doing something she has thought through more carefully than the adults involved, "Dad, it is fine," she said. "He did not take me. I followed him. He kept stopping to wait for me," she said. "He wants to show you." And then Thomas heard the men come out of the trees on the far rim, 4 of them, and he heard the specific sound of a rifle being seated against his shoulder, and he did the only thing available to him, which was to shout. He shouted "no," and in that instant, 3 things happened almost on top of one another. The creature flinched at the sound of his voice, both hands going up over the sides of its head. Somebody on the far rim shouted a command, and Lenora Whitcomb, who had come up the quarry road on foot behind the recovery team because she had known where this was going since the parking lot, stepped out in front of the rifles with both arms out and said, in a voice that carried across the whole pit, "That is a child, and that is a child, and neither of you is going to shoot anything." The recovery team did not fire. You can decide for yourself whether that was Whitcomb, or the presence of an 11-year-old girl, or the fact that recovery means recovery, and a dead subject is a failed operation. Whitcomb, decades later, was under no illusions about which of the 3 it had been. The sun came up over the quarry, and in the grey of it, they all saw what Claire had been sitting beside. Below the second ledge, where a slab of granite had shifted at some point in the last century and dropped 6 feet, there was an opening. It was perhaps 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, a slot between the underside of the slab and the floor of the cut, and it went back into the rock and down at an angle, and it didn't end where the light ended. Cold air was coming out of it. You could see it moving the birch leaves at the entrance. Claire said, "Listen." And they all stood there in the growing light. 14 adults with radios and rifles and 1 girl in a nightgown, and they listened. And from somewhere down in the rock, far enough that the sound arrived thinned and softened by distance, there came a click. 1, then another. And then, in the dark below Dover, Massachusetts, dozens of them answered. It took them 9 hours to widen the opening. They did it carefully, with hand tools and a small hydraulic spreader, because somebody in the chain of command made the decision that explosives were not going to be used, and Whitcomb would say afterward that it was the only genuinely wise decision anyone made that week. Claire was taken home. Margaret sat with her at the kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders and a mug of cocoa she did not drink, and 2 men in plain clothes sat in a car at the end of the driveway all day and did not come to the door. Subject 4 did not go down the hole. That is detail people usually get wrong when they retell this. It had the opportunity. It sat on that ledge through the entire morning while men worked 20 feet away from it, and when the opening was finally wide enough, it did not move toward it. Whitcomb's theory, which he never wrote down anywhere, was that it had been waiting. Thomas went down. He should not have been allowed to, and he was allowed to, and the reason was simple and slightly pathetic, which is that by that point in the afternoon he had photographs, and he had a son who had photographs, and the negotiation that took place at the rim of that quarry between a farmer and a program that did not exist was a negotiation about leverage. He went down third behind 2 men with lights, with Whitcomb behind him. The passage went back 30 feet at a downward angle of about 20 degrees, through a squeeze that 2 of the larger men could not manage, and then it opened. The first chamber was about the size of a 2-car garage. The floor was dry, packed sediment, and it was not empty. There were tools, worked stone, laid in a row along the base of one wall, not dropped and not scattered, but placed in order of size, the way a person lays out a workbench. There were bones, deer, mostly, cracked lengthwise, stacked in a corner. There was a fire ring, a rough circle of stones with a floor of ash and charcoal inside it, and the ceiling above it was black with soot, and the soot was layered, and Whitcomb crouched under it with a light, and looked up at those layers for a long time without saying anything, because layers mean returns, and returns mean generations. And there were symbols on the wall, not pictures. Nobody who saw them ever described them as pictures. They were marks, scratched into the stone with something hard, arranged in horizontal rows, and there were hundreds of them. Some of the marks recurred. Some appeared in clusters of 4 and then 3. The second chamber was larger. The passage into it had been narrowed with stacked stone, fitted without mortar, and the narrowing was recent enough that the dust on top of it was thin. The third chamber was enormous. Thomas Hollingsworth, who had lived his entire life within 40 miles of that spot, stood in a space the size of a church under the fields and the stone walls and the driveways and the mailboxes of Dover, Massachusetts, and shone a light up at a ceiling he could not reach with it. There were passages leading off it. He counted 6. The lights did not reach the end of any of them, and on the floor of the third chamber in the fine dry sediment, undisturbed by wind or water or weather, were footprints. They were everywhere. They overlapped. They crossed and recrossed in a churn of movement, tracks going in every direction, some pressed deep and some barely visible. And among the large ones there were small ones, 6 inches, 5 inches, 4, prints the size of a toddler's hand. And some of them were fresh. You can tell. Sediment that dry holds an edge for a while, and then the edges soften, and there were prints in that chamber whose edges were sharp and clean and crumbling, and one of the men with the lights knelt down and put his hand next to one and said quietly, "Ours." Nobody said anything for a while after that. It was Whitcomb who finally said the thing out loud, and she said it in a voice Thomas described as almost apologetic. She said there was never one of them, and then she said the rest of it, standing in the dark under her own country with a flashlight in her hand. She said, Source Zero was not a last survivor. We told ourselves that for 14 years because it was the only version we could live with. A relict. A final individual of something that ended a long time ago, and we found him, and it was a tragedy, but it was a completed tragedy, and studying him was salvage. She said he was not the last of anything. He was one of them. He was taken. And Thomas, in the dark, said the sentence that ends this section of the story, and that he never repeated to anyone until he was dying. He said, "Then what have they been doing for 14 years while we had him?" The party withdrew at 6:09 in the evening, on the order of a man who had arrived at the quarry that afternoon, and who had not until that point been part of this story at all. They had been underground for 4 hours. They had mapped perhaps 600 feet, and on the way out in the first chamber, one of the men with the light stopped and swept his beam along the base of the wall where the tools had been laid out in a row. There had been 11 of them when they came in. There were 9 now. Special Agent Conrad Voss arrived in Dover at 2:20 in the afternoon on the 27th of April 1977 in a car he drove himself. He was in his late 50s. He wore a suit that had been expensive about 8 years earlier. He was pleasant, unhurried, and entirely without menace, and Whitcomb, who had met perhaps a dozen men like him over the course of her career, said that this was the most frightening thing about him, because men who need to seem dangerous are men who are worried about their authority. He did not shout at anyone. He walked the rim of the quarry, and he listened to the site lead's report, and then he sat down with Thomas Hollingsworth on the tailgate of a truck and explained the situation to him like a reasonable man explaining a zoning issue. But before we get to what Voss said, we have to deal with the last piece of the structure, because it is the piece that turns this from a story about an escape into a story about a plan. It was Samuel who worked it out, and he worked it out from the map. He had seen it in the tent, 20 pins in a line running southwest to northeast. He had assumed, when he first saw it, that they were sighting reports, and that the line was just an accident of where the creature had happened to wander. But the creature had been loose for 6 days when he saw that map, and it had been seen 3 times. 3 sightings, 20 pins. The other 17 pins were older. The line on that map was not a record of where Subject 4 had been. It was a record of something the program had been tracking for years, and Subject 4's route through the woods of Dover had simply landed on top of it, because Subject 4 was following the same thing the pins were following. Whitcomb confirmed it that evening. She did not have to. She chose to, and Thomas always credited her for that. She said, "We did not put the laboratory in Massachusetts because there was cheap land in Massachusetts." She said, "The site selection memorandum for this facility is dated August of 1962. That is 7 months before the excavation crew broke into that chamber. We did not build here and then find him. We came here looking, and then we found him. Since 1959, the program had been chasing an anomaly. Low-frequency acoustic activity in the bedrock of southern New England, appearing in a broad arc, moving, structured. It had been logged first by a seismic array built to monitor for nuclear tests, and it had been misidentified as instrumentation error for 3 years, and then somebody had plotted it against a map and noticed that it was not distributed the way error is distributed. They came to Dover because the signal was strongest under Dover. They dug a hole because they wanted to know what was making it, and the astonishing, appalling, wholly human punchline of the entire program is that when the hole in the ground produced an answer, when the digging worked, when they pulled a living, representative of an unknown branch of humanity out of a sealed chamber in the bedrock of Massachusetts, the institutional response was not to keep looking. It was to stop looking, seal the passages, classify the file, and spend the next 14 years trying to make copies of his eyes. Source Zero was not brought to Dover. Source Zero was found under Dover. He was taken from a room 40 feet from where the program then built its laboratory, and for 14 years he lived in a steel enclosure some 9 miles from a chamber where his people were still laying tools in rows and stacking bones in corners and scratching marks on a wall. And every so often, on certain nights, something down in the rock made a sound that only he could hear. And he pressed the side of his head against the eastern wall. Now, Conrad Voss, on the tailgate of a truck, at the rim of a quarry, at 2:20 in the afternoon. He told Thomas that the tunnels were going to be sealed. Not blasted, sealed, and there is a distinction, and Voss made it clearly. Blasting was off the table. Whatever was down there, nobody in the chain of command wanted to be the person who had provoked it. He told Thomas that every photograph on the property would be surrendered. The 12 exposures of the footprints, Samuel's account, all of it. He told Thomas that he and his wife and his son would sign agreements, and that Claire, being 11, would not sign anything, and that this was a problem Thomas would need to manage himself for the rest of his life as a father. And Thomas Hollingsworth, who was not a coward, said no. He said he would go to the newspapers. He said he would go to his congressman. He said that this was 1977, that the church committee hearings had finished barely a year earlier, that the entire country had just spent 2 years learning what programs like this had been doing to American citizens, and that there had never in the history of the Republic been a better moment to walk into a newsroom with a story about a classified biological program in a Massachusetts wood. He was right about all of it. That is the thing. He was completely, factually right. And Conrad Voss listened to the whole speech without interrupting, and then he reached into his jacket and took out a folded newspaper and handed it over. It was that morning's local paper, and on page 3 there was an article about local teenagers reporting a strange creature near Farm Street, and a reproduction of a drawing by a 17-year-old boy, and a quote from a man identified as a cryptozoologist who had come up from out of state, and a name that had been coined about 72 hours earlier and was already, unmistakably, doing its work. The Dover demon. Voss said, "We are not going to suppress this." He said it kindly, the way you deliver news to someone who has not yet understood their own position. He said, "Mr. Hollingsworth, 3 days ago I had a containment failure in a residential county and no cover story on the shelf, and I have spent 30 years in this work and I have never in my life been handed a gift like the one those children just handed me." And then he explained it, and the explanation is the reason this story is worth telling. He said, If I put out a denial, I create a question. If I confiscate that boy's drawing, I create a mystery. If I put men in suits in this town to tell people they did not see what they saw, then in 2 years there is a paperback, and in 5 years there is a congressional staffer with a filing cabinet, and in 10 years I am sitting at a table in Washington with a microphone in front of me. He said, but if I do nothing, he said, if I do absolutely nothing at all, then in 6 months, this is a monster. It is a demon. It is a story that gets told at a campfire and printed in a magazine with a drawing of a goblin on the cover. It joins the Jersey Devil and the Mothman and the Lake Monsters, and the moment it joins them, it is over. Because those stories are not investigated. They are enjoyed. He said, nobody has ever subpoenaed a cryptid. He said, in a decade the serious people will be arguing about whether 4 teenagers saw a moose calf, and the unserious people will be arguing about whether it came from another planet. Not one single person in either camp will ever ask the only question that could hurt me, which is whether anyone was doing federally funded biological research within 10 miles of Farm Street. And Thomas Hollingsworth sat on the tailgate of a truck and understood that he had lost, and understood exactly how, and understood that the mechanism of his defeat was not force, or law, or threat. It was folklore. The cover-up did not look like a cover-up, that was the whole point. It looked like a small town having an interesting spring. Cryptozoologists arrived, journalists arrived, first local, then regional, then a wire pickup that put the phrase Dover Demon into newspapers as far away as the Midwest. Investigators interviewed the teenagers, carefully and repeatedly, and the teenagers held to their accounts, because their accounts were true. Theories flowered. There was a foal, born too early, staggering in the dark. There was a moose calf, which is a genuinely strange-looking animal, and which has been the leading sceptical explanation for decades, and which has the modest problem of being roughly 600 pounds heavier than what 4 people described. It was a monkey escaped from somebody's illegal collection. It was an owl. It was a hoax by clever boys. It was a visitor. It was a demon, in the actual theological sense, and there were people in eastern Massachusetts that spring who genuinely believed that. Every one of those theories is an argument about what the witnesses saw. Not one of them is a question about who else was in those woods. The debate consumed itself for 50 years. It is still going. And in all that time, in all the books and articles and documentaries and forum posts and podcasts, the number of investigators who have filed a records request for federal land use, contracting, or research authorizations within a 10-mile radius of Farm Street for the period 1961 to 1977 is, according to this story, 0. Because you do not audit a folk tale. The Hollingsworths signed. Thomas signed on the 28th of April. Margaret signed the same afternoon. Samuel, who was 16, signed a document that was almost certainly not enforceable against a minor, and which functioned as such documents do, entirely on the strength of a boy's belief that it was. The photographs went. All 12 exposures, the negatives, and the camera itself. The recovery operation stood down on the 2nd of May. The passages at the quarry were sealed with a poured plug and a steel plate, and a story about liability and the town's insurance, and the quarry rim was fenced, and the fence is, in the story, still there. Subject 4 was recovered on the 29th of April. It did not resist. It had been sitting on the same ledge for 2 days, and when they finally came for it with a net and a pole and 2 men in padded gear, it did not run. Whitcomb was there. She said it looked at the sealed opening, and then it looked at the men, and then it folded its hands over the sides of its head and waited. She resigned in 1979. She never worked in her field again. She spent the rest of her career doing environmental compliance work for a paper company in Maine, which she described, once, to Samuel Hollingsworth, as the only job she had ever held where the worst thing that could happen was a fine. Thomas Hollingsworth farmed that land for another 31 years. He never spoke publicly about April of 1977. He did not go to the newspapers. He did not write a book. When the Dover Demon came up at the feed store, as it did every few years, he would say that it was probably a moose calf, and people would nod and the subject would change. Claire stopped clicking at the window. She grew up. She became a hydrologist, which her family always thought was funny, and which she never once explained. And the thing that Voss had promised would happen, happened exactly on schedule. The story got bigger and stranger and more beloved every single decade, and as it did, it got safer and safer, until by the 21st century the Dover Demon was a t-shirt, a road sign photo op, a name on a beer, a Halloween decoration, a bit of local colour in a wealthy town that has, by any measure, been extremely good-natured about the whole thing. There is no monument, there is no museum. There is a stone wall on Farm Street that looks like every other stone wall in New England, and people stop and take photographs of it, and then they drive home. Thomas Hollingsworth died in the autumn of 2008 at the age of 79. Samuel came back to close the house. He was 47 years old. He had a family of his own in Vermont and a career and a mortgage, and had not seriously thought about April of 1977 in a decade, which is what happens, and which is not a failure of character but simply the way a life fills up. He found it on the fourth day, pulling up the water-damaged boards in the back hall closet, where a pipe had leaked at some point in the 90s. There was a gap between the joists. In the gap was a metal document box wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth and taped shut. Inside were photographs, not 12, 31. Because Thomas Hollingsworth, in the 3rd week of April in 1977, had bought a second camera at a drugstore in Natick and had never once mentioned it to anybody, including his wife, and had gone on quietly taking pictures of the strangest event of his life for 11 days, while pretending to be a bewildered farmer. The first 6 were the footprints in the paddock with a wooden ruler for scale, then the beige sedan in his driveway, shot through a kitchen window with the plate legible, then the road at night, 4 vehicles, no headlights. Then, taken from the top of the rise at a range Samuel recognised instantly, because he had lain on his stomach in that exact spot, the Night Harvest command post, the light towers, the tent, the trucks, 14 people and 4 rifles in a clearing 3 miles from an elementary school, then the quarry, the rim, the opening under the shifted slab and the fence, then, and this one Samuel had to sit down for, a photograph of a girl in a nightgown sitting cross-legged on a granite ledge in the grey light before dawn, with something 4 feet away from her that is unmistakably not a person, and both of them looking at the camera. And then, at the bottom of the box, in a paper sleeve of its own, one photograph that Thomas Hollingsworth could not possibly have taken. It is a copy. A photograph of a photograph, shot at an angle, with the edges of the original visible and a thumb at the corner. Somebody had held it up and somebody else had photographed it, and the second somebody had been in a hurry. It shows an interior, a long room with a walkway down the centre and chambers along one side. Samuel counted them, 12. Most are empty, one is not. In the last chamber on the left, standing upright against the glass with one long hand raised and flat against it, is a pale figure, and the thing that Samuel could not get past, the thing he described to his own children many years later, is that it is big, not 4 feet. It fills the frame of that chamber, its head nearly reaches the top. Beneath the photograph, on the white border of the original, somebody had written 3 lines in ballpoint pen, Source 0, recovered March 14th, 1963, location Dover, Massachusetts. And under those 3 lines, in different handwriting, pressed hard enough that the pen had torn the paper slightly, was a 4th. Second colony confirmed. Estimated population unknown. Samuel Hollingsworth sat on the floor of his dead father's back hallway with a photograph in his hands, and worked through what that sentence meant, 1 piece at a time, the way his father had worked through the word recovery in a kitchen in 1977. Second colony. Not second chamber, not second site. Colony. The government had not found a creature under Dover, Massachusetts. They had found a population. And then, at some point somewhere else, they had found another one. So here is the shape of it. All the way through, one last time, gently, while you're lying there in the dark. For almost 50 years, people have argued about the Dover Demon. They have argued that it was an alien. They have argued that it was a cryptid, some unclassified animal living quietly at the edges of a crowded state. They have argued that it was a foal or a moose calf or an owl in bad light. They have argued that 4 teenagers made it up and never once, in half a century of interviews, slipped. According to the conspiracy, the thing that William Bartlett saw on a stone wall on Farm Street on the night of April 21st, 1977, and the thing that John Baxter saw gripping a tree in a gully 2 hours later, and the thing that Abby Brabham saw crouched by the road the following night, was a 7-year-old designated Subject 4. Made in a building 9 miles away, out of pieces of us and pieces of an older cousin of ours who had been pulled out of a sealed chamber in the bedrock in March of 1963. It was not hunting. It was not haunting. It was walking east through a town full of headlights and dogs toward a slot in the granite at the bottom of an abandoned quarry, because something down there had made a sound and it had recognised the sound. 4 clicks, a pause, then 3. And the reason the story survived, the reason it is still told, the reason there are t-shirts and road signs and podcasts and this very episode, is not that the cover-up failed. It is that the cover-up worked perfectly. There is a photograph. It sits in a footlocker in an attic in Virginia for something close to 60 years, and nobody looks at it because nobody knows it is there. When it's finally found, it looks like nothing. 6 men in laboratory coats, a machine behind them, all copper coil and welded frame, a concrete room with a low ceiling. The kind of picture that turns up in 10,000 boxes from that war and means nothing to anyone but the family. But if you hold it under a lamp, if you tilt it, there is a 7th figure in that room, and in a moment we're going to talk about how it got there. But first, we have to go back to April and to a small unit of American soldiers driving south into the Bavarian Alps with orders that make absolutely no sense. It is April of 1945, and the Third Reich is coming apart the way a rope comes apart, one strand at a time, faster and faster. The Americans are pushing east, the Soviets are pushing west. Between them, Germany is folding inward, and the men on the ground can feel it. Whole divisions are surrendering to sergeants. Towns are hanging white bedsheets from the upper windows before the first jeep arrives. In some places the resistance is savage, and in most places it has simply stopped, because there is nothing left to resist with. And moving through that collapse threaded quietly into the advancing columns are units that are not really fighting units at all. They are collectors. They wear the same uniforms. They carry the same rifles. But their orders are strange. They are told to bypass targets. They are told to leave weapons depots alone, to drive past intact armour, to ignore surrendering garrisons and keep moving toward addresses written on paper that most of the men in the truck are not allowed to read. They are looking for laboratories. They are looking for filing cabinets and wind tunnels and blueprints and blackboards with equations still chalked across them. They are looking for the machinery of German science, and above all they are looking for the people who built it, because in the last months of that war both the Americans and the Soviets came to the same quiet conclusion at almost exactly the same moment. The war is already decided, the next one is not, and the next one will be won by whoever gets the physicists. So on a cold morning in the second week of April, one of those units receives a set of orders that stands out even in a war full of strange orders. They are given a location, a hydroelectric station in the southern hills, an old one built before the war sitting on a small river in a valley with a single road running into it. They are told the station is not the objective. They are told there is something underneath it. The unit drives most of the day. The road narrows, the trees close in. The men in the back of the truck talk less and less, the way men do when they are being taken somewhere without being told why. When they arrive, the valley is completely silent. No guards, no vehicles, no dogs. The turbine house is intact and the water is still running through it, which means the generators are still turning, which means somewhere in that building there is still power moving through wire. They find the entrance behind a maintenance door that has been left standing open. Stairs go down, a long way down. And at the bottom of those stairs there is a laboratory. Not a bunker, not a factory. A laboratory, with tiled floors and drainage channels and heavy doors and a ventilation system that is still humming. There are workbenches with tools laid out in order. There are ledgers open on desks. There is a coffee cup on a windowsill that has no window behind it, and the coffee in that cup has dried to a ring at the bottom, which tells the men something they do not want to know, which is that people were drinking coffee down here very recently. Every instrument is still in place. Every notebook is still on the shelf. And there is not one single human being anywhere in the complex. No bodies, no blood, no sign of a fight, no sign of an evacuation either. No half-packed crates, no burn barrels, no ash. When a German facility was abandoned in those weeks, it usually looked like it. Documents were destroyed. Equipment was smashed or dynamited. Somebody always tried to leave less behind than they found. Not here. Here it looks like everyone simply stood up in the middle of the afternoon and walked out. The lieutenant in command walks the length of the main corridor with a flashlight, and at the far end, on a bare stretch of concrete wall between 2 doorways, he finds a sentence. Someone has written it by hand, in German, in grease pencil, the soft kind used to mark metal, pressed hard enough that the letters are almost carved. It says, You arrived after the experiment. The lieutenant does not speak German. He copies the letters into his notebook exactly as they appear, drawing them rather than writing them, and it will be another 11 days before anyone translates it for him. By then, the laboratory will already have been sealed, catalogued, and removed from every list it ever appeared on. To understand what happens next, you have to understand what the last months of that war actually looked like from above, from the level where the decisions were being made. By early 1945, Allied intelligence has stopped thinking about German science as a threat and started thinking about it as inventory. There is an enormous amount of it. Germany spends the 1930s and the war years building one of the most concentrated scientific establishments in human history, and by the spring of that final year it is scattered in pieces across a collapsing country. Rocket work at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, underground production at Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains, carved into rock by prisoners under conditions that are still difficult to read about, aeronautics laboratories in Bavaria, chemical facilities in Saxony, optics in the east, metallurgy in the west, research institutes tucked into requisitioned schools and monasteries and country houses because the cities are no longer safe to work in, and all of it is about to fall into somebody's hands. The Americans send in specialist teams. So do the British. So do the Soviets, moving fast and taking whole facilities apart down to the bolts, loading rail cars with lathes and generators and shipping them east along with the men who knew how to run them. It becomes, quite literally, a race. Not for territory. Territory is already carved up on maps signed months earlier. This is a race for people, and everybody involved understands that the maps do not matter, because a scientist who is standing in the Soviet zone on Tuesday can be standing in the American zone on Wednesday, if you get to him first and offer him something worth moving for. What you offer him is simple: food, safety, his family, a future that is not a rubble field, and for some of them, silence about the previous 6 years. That last part is where the American program becomes genuinely uncomfortable, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not fiction. It is the documented history. The men being recruited were not neutral academics who happened to live in Germany. Many of them held party membership, some held SS rank, some had worked directly on programs that used forced labour and had walked through those production tunnels and had signed off on what they saw there. American intelligence officers knew this. Investigators wrote reports saying so plainly, and a decision was made at a level above those investigators that the value of what these men knew outweighed the record of what they had done. Files were revised, assessments were softened, words like ardent were replaced with words like nominal. Security reports that recommended against admission were quietly reissued with different conclusions, and men who had been formally judged a potential threat to Allied interests were, within a matter of months, boarding transport aircraft with visas in hand. That was the real program. That is what the name refers to. Somebody in a filing office in Germany began attaching a simple metal paperclip to the dossiers of the scientists selected for relocation, a small physical marker to separate them from the rest of the stack, and the clerks began calling it paperclip, and the name stuck, and eventually it went on the letterhead. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians came to the United States under that program and the ones that followed it. They built missiles at White Sands. They built engines in Alabama. Several of them stood in mission control at the Kennedy Space Center on the July morning when a rocket they had designed carried 3 men toward the moon. And if you have ever seen that footage, you have seen their faces, without knowing whose they were. That is history. All of it happened. The conspiracy begins with a much smaller question. It begins with a man noticing that the numbers do not add up. His name in this story is Major Thomas Calloway, and in the spring of 1945 he is 34 years old, and he is very good at exactly one thing. He is good at lists. Calloway is not a field officer. He does not kick doors. He is an intelligence administrator, which in that war meant a man in a requisitioned office with a coal stove and 4 filing cabinets and a typewriter that jams on the letter that comes after D. His job is to receive the reports coming in from the collection teams and to reconcile them, and reconciliation is a very specific kind of work. It means making sure that what one document says matches what another document says. It means noticing when a truck that left with 9 crates arrives with 8, and finding out where the 9th went, and writing that down. It is tedious work. It is also historically the way almost every real secret has ever come apart, because secrets are not usually broken by heroes. They are broken by clerks with good memories. In late April, Calloway is handed a stack of recruitment dossiers to cross-reference against a master roster. He works through them for 2 days. Rocket engineers, propulsion specialists, guidance men, metallurgists. The names that will later become familiar to anyone who reads about the American space program, appearing here for the first time as ordinary personnel files, with photographs stapled to the corner. Then he reaches a folder that does not fit. The formatting is identical. The paper stock is identical. The stamps are identical. But the roster it references does not exist in his files, and the men listed in it are not engineers. They are theorists. Calloway does what a good administrator does. He requests the master roster from the originating office, in writing, through the correct channel, using the correct form, and nothing comes back. Not a refusal, not a delay notice, nothing at all, which in a bureaucracy is a much louder answer than no. He requests it again 11 days later. This time something does come back. A single typed line, unsigned, on paper, with no letterhead. It says that the referenced roster is not held at this command. Calloway sits with that sentence for a long time. He is a man who has spent 3 years learning exactly how the machine writes when it is telling the truth, and this is not how it writes. Not held at this command is not a denial that the roster exists. It is a statement about geography. It is somebody being extremely careful, so he does the thing that will consume the rest of his life. He starts keeping his own list. The folder Calloway is chasing surfaces properly 6 weeks later, and it surfaces by accident, which is how these things usually happen. A shipment of captured material is misrouted. A crate that should have gone to one office is delivered to his, and by the time the error is discovered, Calloway has already signed for it, opened it, and inventoried the contents, because that is his job, and he does it the same way every time. Inside, beneath the expected documents, there is a folder bound in black cloth. There is no title on it, no case number, no routing stamps, which is itself extraordinary, because in that war everything had routing stamps. A folder with no stamps has never officially travelled anywhere. It has never been sent, received, filed, or read. On paper, it has not moved since it was created. Across the front in stencil are 2 words, Section Black. Inside are 12 entries. Each entry is a single page. Name, date of birth, field of specialisation, last known posting. And at the bottom of each page, a rectangle of blank paper slightly lighter than the rest, where a photograph used to be, with 4 small holes where the staples were pulled out. 12 men. No faces. And when Calloway reads the specialisations, he sits back in his chair, because he has been reading personnel files for 3 years, and he has never once seen a list like this assembled for a military purpose. There is not one engineer among them. There are 4 theoretical physicists, 2 mathematicians working in fields. Calloway has to look up, and when he does look them up, he finds they are branches of geometry, with no obvious application to anything that flies or explodes. 3. Crystallographers, men who study how matter arranges itself into ordered structure. 2 experimental chemists, and 1 man whose specialisation line contains a single word that Callaway cannot find in any technical dictionary available to him in Germany in 1945. That word is a compound. A German compound, the kind the language builds by welding smaller words together, and the closest he can render it is field resonance stability. He copies all 12 names into his notebook. Then he reseals the crate, files the misrouting error correctly, and sends it on to the office it was meant to reach in the first place, because Callaway is careful, and careful men do not steal folders. Careful men copy them and let them go, and wait. That night he writes a single line at the bottom of the page, and it is the first genuinely unofficial thing he has written since he put on the uniform. Rockets do not need crystallographers. The Harz Mountains sit in the middle of Germany like a closed fist. They are old mountains, worn down and thickly forested, riddled with the tunnels of a mining industry that goes back something like 1,000 years. Which is precisely why, in the last 2 years of the war, Germany begins moving its most important production into them. The bombing has made surface factories impossible, so the work goes underground, into the old workings and the new ones, into galleries carved out by prisoners in conditions that killed thousands of them. Nordhausen is in those mountains. That is documented. When American troops reach it in April of 1945, they find an underground rocket factory and alongside it a camp, and the men who walk into that place spend the rest of their lives trying not to describe it. But Callaway is not looking for Nordhausen. He is looking for a site that does not appear on any captured map. He finds his first trace of it in an unlikely place, which is a freight schedule. Railway administration in wartime Germany is meticulous almost to the point of absurdity, and even as the country disintegrates, somebody in a signal office is still writing down what went where. Callaway obtains a bundle of these schedules for the Harz region, and reads them the way other men read novels, night after night, in a cold office, with a pencil. And he finds a spur line, a short one, roughly 11 kilometres of track branching off a main line and running into a valley on the southern edge of the range, ending at a facility designated only by a 3-letter code with no expansion, listed anywhere in the documentation he can access. Between 1943 and the end of 1944, that spur receives traffic almost every week. The manifests are the interesting part. There is no steel arriving in quantity, no aluminum, no propellant chemicals, no machine tooling of the kind a production facility devours. Instead, there is copper, an enormous amount of copper, far more than a site that size should need. There is high-grade optical glass, there is quartz, there is a category listed simply as instrumentation, appearing again and again, with weights that suggest something being assembled piece by piece over the better part of 2 years. And there is one more entry that stops him. Concrete. Reinforced concrete delivered continuously, long after the structure would have been finished. You do not keep pouring concrete into a completed building, unless you are pouring it around something. Callaway cross-references the coordinates against Allied aerial reconnaissance. The photographic interpretation branch has thousands of these images, taken by high-altitude aircraft, most of them never examined closely because there were simply not enough analysts in the world to look at all of them. He finds 3 passes over that valley. The first, from the summer of 1943, shows tree cover and a road. The second, from the following spring, shows the same trees and the same road, and a slightly different shape at the base of the slope, and a scattering of pale marks on the hillside that an analyst has annotated as spoil, meaning rock removed from underground and dumped outside. The third pass, from January of 1945, shows something the analyst has circled twice in grease pencil and never followed up on. Snow lies across the whole valley, except in one place. There is a strip on the eastern slope, roughly 40 metres long, where the snow is. Simply not there, not melted into slush, not disturbed by vehicles, just absent, in a clean band, as though that section of the mountain is warmer than everything around it. Something inside that hill is producing a great deal of heat, in the middle of winter, in a country that has by that point almost no fuel left for anything. Calloway requests permission to visit the site. Permission is denied twice without explanation. So in the first week of August, he takes 4 days of leave, borrows a vehicle he's not entitled to borrow, and drives there himself. The tunnel entrance is not hidden. That is the first thing that strikes him, and he thinks about it for years afterward. He's been imagining something concealed, a door under brush, a shaft behind a false rock face. Instead, there is a proper portal, wide enough for a truck, framed in poured concrete and set into the hillside as squarely as a subway entrance. Whoever built it did not expect to be found by accident. They expected to be protected by paperwork. The doors are open. Inside, the air is cool and dry and smells faintly of ozone and machine oil. The main gallery runs straight into the rock for perhaps 180 metres, lit by fixtures that are still working, because the site is drawing power from a substation 2 valleys over that nobody has thought to switch off. And exactly as in Bavaria, exactly as in the laboratory beneath the hydroelectric station, everything is still there. Calloway walks through it slowly with a flashlight he does not need. He passes a machine shop with tools hanging on a pegboard, each one outlined in painted silhouette so you can see at a glance if something is missing. Nothing is missing. He passes a drafting room with a half-finished technical drawing still pinned to the board and a set of dividers laid across it. He passes a small canteen with plates stacked in a rack, dry, clean, put away by somebody who expected to come back and use them. He passes offices with correspondence still in the trays. He passes a library, an actual library, 3 walls of technical volumes, German and English and French and Russian, with a card index and a stamp for checking books out. Nothing has been burned. Nothing has been broken. In 4 months, nobody has even looted it. And the deeper he goes, the more the arithmetic of the place bothers him. Because this is not a small facility. This is a serious installation, dug at enormous cost, at a moment in the war when Germany could not afford to dig anything. Somebody signed for this. Somebody moved thousands of tons of rock and hundreds of tons of copper into a mountain in the middle of a losing war, and then walked away from it without destroying a single page. At the far end of the main gallery there is a cross corridor with rooms opening off both sides, numbered in stenciled paint. Calloway walks it slowly. Room 1 is a store. Room 2 is a workshop. Room 3 is empty but scuffed, the floor scarred where heavy equipment sat for a long time and was later moved. Rooms 4 through 8 are laboratories in various states of ordinary use, benches and glassware and racks. Rooms 9, 10, 11 and 12 are offices, and then there is room 13. The door to room 13 is not like the others. The other doors are wood or thin steel, ordinary interior doors set into ordinary frames. This one is a slab of steel roughly 8 centimetres thick with a wheel mechanism on it, more like the door of a bank vault than anything else in the mountain, and it is standing wide open, pushed back flat against the wall. Calloway steps through it, and stops. The room is empty, not empty the way an unfurnished room is empty the way a wound is clean. There are no benches, no fittings, no wiring, no light fixtures, no conduit, nothing bolted to anything, and where all of those things used to be there are only anchor holes and pale rectangles on the walls, and the floor is gone. That is the part he cannot get past. Somebody has taken up the concrete floor of a room inside a mountain, broken it out, lifted it, carried it away, and swept the bedrock underneath, and there is not a chip of it left anywhere in the corridor outside. Calloway stands in the middle of that bare rock for a long time, with his flashlight off, listening to the ventilation system move air through a mountain for a facility with nobody in it. He measures the room by pacing it, roughly 11 metres by 11 metres, square. The ceiling is unusually high, perhaps 6 metres, and near the top of each of the 4 walls there is a heavy steel plate bolted flat against the stone, painted the same grey as everything else, with cabling stubs cut off flush. 4 anchor points, high. At the corners of a square room, whatever was mounted up there was mounted in a very deliberate geometry, and it was aimed at the centre of the floor, and the floor is what somebody decided could not be left behind. He is standing there when he notices the smell. It is faint, and it is not machine oil, and it is not ozone. It is the smell you get from a lightning strike a field away, sharp and metallic and slightly sweet, and it should not still be present in a sealed room 4 months after the last person left it. Calloway leaves room 13 and does not go back in. He spends the remaining 2 days going through the parts of the facility that were left intact, and on the afternoon of the second day, in a maintenance crawlway behind the ventilation plant, he finds the notebook. It has been pushed into a gap between a duct and the rock wall, well back, at arm's length, where a hand would have to know to reach. It is a standard laboratory journal, hard-bound, quarter-filled. There is no name on the cover. The handwriting inside is small, upright, and disciplined, and it belongs to somebody who has kept notebooks his entire professional life. Calloway takes it back to his room that night in a village inn 11 kilometres away, and reads it with a German dictionary open beside him, working slowly, and by 2 in the morning he understands 3 things about it. The first is that the author is not describing a weapon. There is no mention of yield, of blast, of range, of delivery, of anything that could be aimed at a city. The vocabulary is entirely the vocabulary of measurement. The second is that the same phrase appears on nearly every page, the compound word from the section black folder, the one he could not find in a dictionary. Field resonance stability. The entries track it obsessively. Duration, threshold, decay, attempts to hold something steady, failures to hold it steady, small improvements measured in fractions of a second. There is a table near the back where a column of numbers climbs slowly over what appears to be many months, and next to the final entry in that column somebody has drawn a small horizontal line, the way you underline a result you consider important. The third thing is the one that keeps him awake. Every single entry, regardless of what it contains, ends with the same sentence. Not a conclusion, not a signature, just one line, written at the bottom of the page, in the same hand, in the same ink, every time. The doorway remains open. It takes Calloway most of the following year to work out who was paying for the mountain. He does it through invoices, which is a deeply unglamorous way to uncover anything, and which is also the only reliable way, because organisations lie about what they do, and almost never lie about what they spend. The facility in the Harz has no line in the armaments budget. It does not appear in the accounts of the rocket programme, which by that stage of the war was one of the most expensive undertakings in German history, and was therefore documented in enormous, self-justifying detail. It is not attached to the Air Ministry. It is not attached to the Navy. Its funding runs through a scientific directorate operating under the SS. That is not, in itself, unusual. The SS ran research organisations of its own, some of them serious, some of them pseudo-scientific in ways that are genuinely bizarre to read about now. Expeditions and racial theories and archaeology bent into the shape of ideology. There was money in that system, and it went to strange places. What is unusual is the isolation. The scientists at Peenemünde argued constantly with the scientists at other institutes. They competed for resources, poached staff, wrote furious memoranda about each other. It was a scientific establishment, which means it was a community, which means it was noisy. The Harz site is silent. No inter-institute correspondence, no shared personnel, no conference attendance, no request for peer review, no exchange of samples, nothing. In 2 years of operation, a facility employing at least 40 technical staff appears to have written to almost nobody outside its own perimeter, except once. Calloway finds a single carbon copy of a single letter, retained in an armaments ministry file for reasons that were probably just filing habit. It is a request for materials, and it is written in the flat defensive tone of a man who knows his request is going to be questioned. The letter asks for additional copper and additional quartz, and to justify the request it includes 2 sentences of explanation. The first sentence says that the work concerns the behaviour of high-energy fields under conditions of extreme geometric symmetry. The second sentence says that the work has no aviation application, no ballistic application, and no direct weapons application, and requests that it therefore not be transferred to the armaments programme. Calloway reads that twice. In the final years of that war, every German scientific project on Earth was scrambling to prove it was militarily useful, because usefulness meant fuel, food, labour and protection from being conscripted into an infantry unit and fed into the Eastern Front. Men exaggerated wildly. Men promised miracle weapons they had no ability to build because the alternative was a rifle and a train ticket. And here is a facility spending an enormous amount of money writing to the ministry to insist that its work is not a weapon and should be left alone. Which means either the men running it were suicidally honest, or they had something they were extremely determined to keep away from the people who make weapons. The nature of what they had comes out slowly, in fragments, and never completely. Some of it Calloway assembles from the notebook, some from correspondence recovered elsewhere, some from a set of internal progress summaries that turn up years later in a box of unrelated material, because that is how archives work, and anyone who has ever spent a week in one will tell you the same thing. The thing you're looking for is never in the file with its name on it. It is in the file next to it, misplaced by a tired person in 1946. Here is what the fragments say. The team was not trying to open anything. That is important, and it is the detail that makes the whole story feel different from the usual wartime miracle machine mythology. They were not building a portal. They were not attempting contact. They were studying, in the most conservative and mathematical way possible, the behaviour of extremely strong electromagnetic fields, arranged in a precise three-dimensional symmetry, and they were doing it for reasons that were essentially academic, because one of them had produced a piece of theoretical work in the late 1930s that predicted an effect nobody had ever tested. The effect was small. The theory said that under a specific set of conditions, in a very specific geometry, at a very specific field intensity, the local structure of space would deviate from expectation by an amount so tiny that measuring it would require instruments that did not yet exist, which is why they needed the copper, and the quartz, and the 2 years, and the mountain, because the mountain provided the one thing you cannot buy, which is stillness. Bedrock does not vibrate. Bedrock does not care about weather. If you are trying to detect a deviation at the edge of measurability, you go underground. They ran their first full power test in the autumn of 1943. It produced nothing. Instruments recorded noise. The field collapsed after less than a second, and the collapse damaged 3 of the 4 coil assemblies, and it took them 4 months to rebuild. The second test, the following spring, held the field for slightly over 2 seconds. The third held it for 6. And somewhere between the third and the fourth, the numbers in that column at the back of the notebook stop being a record of endurance and start being a record of something else, because a new heading appears above them. Observed persistence of secondary presence. The 4th test is the one everything else in this story hangs from. It is run in the late summer of 1944 at night, because the power draw is enormous and the substation cannot support it during working hours. There are, according to the personnel log, 9 people inside the facility at the time. 6 of them are in the control room, which is separated from room 13 by 3 meters of rock and a steel door, and observes it through a periscope arrangement of mirrors, because nobody is willing to put a human eye behind a glass window into that space. The field is brought up over 11 minutes. It stabilises, and then, according to the summary, the observer at the periscope stops reporting numbers. There is a gap in the log of approximately 20 seconds. When the entries resume, they are not in the same handwriting as the entries before them, which suggests that whoever was writing put the pen down and somebody else picked it up. The line reads, "Object present in chamber, not of our construction." That is all it says. The subsequent report, written the next morning, is longer and considerably more careful. and it contains the detail that Calloway would still be thinking about 40 years later. The object did not arrive. It did not fly in or fall or materialize in a burst of light or do any of the things that stories of this kind usually include. According to the observers, at the instant the field reached stability, the object was simply already there, in the centre of the room, standing on the floor, as though it had been there the entire time and the field had merely made it possible to see. It was described as roughly 2 meters tall, dark, upright, regular in outline but not identifiable as any piece of equipment known to the facility, and it remained visible for 17 seconds, not approximately 17. The report is emphatic on this point, because there were 2 independent chronometers running and they agreed. 17 seconds, from the moment of field stability to the moment the object was no longer visible, and the object ceased to be visible before the field was reduced, which is the detail that unsettles the writer of the report most of all. They did not turn it off and lose it. It left while the door was still open. After that entry, there are 4 more pages in the notebook. Then the pages stop mid-sentence in the middle of a line, and the rest of the journal is blank. The final words on the final written page are the beginning of a sentence that is never completed. It says, "We must consider the possibility that observation is not," and then nothing. Calloway spends decades trying to find the rest of that record, and he never does, and there is a reasonable explanation for that which he never entirely accepts, which is that the rest of that record was in room 13, and room 13 was taken away down to the bedrock. There is one more thing about the mountain, and it is the thing that turns Calloway from a curious officer into an obsessed one. He learns it in 1949 from a Soviet defector in a debriefing he's not supposed to be attending and attends anyway, sitting at the back with a notepad, pretending to be a stenographer. The defector is a minor intelligence officer, not important, offering the usual mixture of the useful and the invented. But partway through the second session he mentions, almost in passing, a facility in the Harz that his unit reached in the spring of 1945. Calloway sits up so fast that the man beside him looks over. The Soviets arrived, according to the defector, on a morning in April, guided by a captured railway document, expecting to find a production site. They found an empty laboratory with every instrument in place, and one room stripped to the rock. They found it approximately 9 hours after the Americans left, which is the first genuinely impossible piece of the whole story, and here is why. The American unit that entered that mountain was not the unit Calloway later belonged to. It was a specialist collection team, and its report exists, and Calloway has read it. The report describes the tunnel, the library, the canteen, the stripped room. It is thorough, it is competent, it is signed, and it concludes that the facility was of no significant intelligence value and recommends no further action. The Soviet report, which the defector describes from memory, reaches exactly the same conclusion. No significant value, no further action. A disused research station of academic character, nothing worth removing. 2 intelligence services, at the absolute peak of a race in which each was stripping Germany of every microscope and slide rule it could physically lift. Both walked into a purpose-built underground laboratory containing an intact technical library, functioning instrumentation, and 2 years of research notes. And both of them wrote it down as nothing, and neither of them removed a single item. Calloway believes exactly one thing after that debriefing, and he believes it for the rest of his life. 2 governments did not independently make the same mistake. 2 governments made the same decision, so Calloway goes looking for 12 men. He has their names, he has their dates of birth, he has their fields, and he has a rectangle of blank paper where each of their faces used to be, and he begins the slow work of turning 12 names into 12 people. It should be easy. That is the thing worth understanding here. Germany in the first half of the 20th century was one of the most comprehensively documented societies that had ever existed. Everybody was registered. Births, marriages, addresses, employment, church membership, military service, university enrollment. If you lived in a German town in 1930, there were at least 6 separate offices that could tell a stranger where you slept, and a great deal of that survived the war. Damaged, scattered, burned in places, but not erased. Genealogists work in those records to this day. Calloway writes to the registry offices in 12 towns. 6 of them write back to say that no record exists under that name and date. 3 write back to say that a record existed and is missing, with the specific note that the page has been removed from the bound volume rather than the volume being destroyed, which is a distinction a registrar would notice and mention. 2 do not reply at all. 1 replies with a photocopy of a birth entry that has been struck through with a single line of ink, and beside it, in a different hand, a marginal annotation consisting of a date in 1944 and 2 letters that Calloway is never able to identify. He tries the universities next. Same pattern. Doctoral theses that are listed in the catalogue and absent from the shelf. Faculty photographs from which one figure has been carefully removed, not cut out crudely but excised, and the gap closed. The print rephotographed so the group is slightly narrower than it should be. Examination records with a line missing between 2 students whose surnames are alphabetically 2 apart. And then, in 1953, he finds a family. The sister of one of the 12, living outside Hamburg in her 60s, willing to talk to an American officer because at that point in her life she has nothing left that anyone could take. She tells him her brother was a quiet boy who was good at mathematics and terrible at everything else, that he went to university and stayed there, that he was not political, which she says with some force, and which Calloway has heard from a great many German families by that point, and has learned to receive without comment. She tells him that in 1943 he took a position he could not describe, and moved somewhere he could not name, and wrote every month, and that the letters had no return address, and were postmarked from 4 different cities. The last letter arrives in February of 1945. After the war, she does what tens of thousands of German families did. She registers him missing. She writes to the Red Cross. She waits through the returns of prisoners from the East year after year, standing at station platforms into the 1950s, which is a detail Calloway records in his notes and never manages to write about without stopping. And here is what she says at the end of the interview, and it is the reason he keeps the transcript for the rest of his life. She says that in 1949 2 men came to the house, not soldiers, civilians, in good coats, one of whom spoke German with an accent she could not place. They did not search anything. They did not threaten her. They sat in her kitchen for perhaps 20 minutes and asked her whether her brother had ever sent her anything, papers, photographs, objects. She said no, because it was true. And as they were leaving, she asked them the only question that mattered to her, which was whether her brother was dead. And one of them stopped in the doorway and said, "We're not able to answer that. Not, we do not know. Not, I am sorry. We're not able to." In 80 years, no death certificate is ever issued for any of the 12. Not one. Not in Germany, not in the Soviet zone, not through any of the international tracing services that spent decades resolving exactly these cases. Millions of people vanished in that war, and most of them were eventually accounted for on paper, if only as a name on a list of the unaccounted. 12 men simply stop. The convoy is the last hard piece of evidence Calloway ever finds, and he finds it in 1961 in a transport log that has been declassified by accident as part of a batch relating to something else entirely. It is one line. A movement order, dated 3 days after the Hart's facility was entered, and reported as being of no significant value. It authorises a convoy of 6 vehicles with an escort to travel from a marshalling point in central Germany to a port of embarkation. The origin is given by grid reference rather than name. Calloway plots it. It falls in the valley with the spur line. The destination field says, "as directed." The cargo field is the part he photographs twice, with 2 different cameras, because he does not entirely trust that the document will still exist when he goes back for it. Scientific personnel, priority 1. no names, no manifest, no count of passengers, which is a violation of every transport regulation in existence, because armies count people obsessively and always have. There is no signature block. There is a rank, a unit, and a stamp, and where the name should be typed there is a row of small letter X characters, which is what a clerk types when they have been told to leave a field blank and the form will not accept blank. And the authorising office in the corner, in the smallest print on the page, is not a military command at all. It is a scientific liaison section that, as far as Callaway can ever establish, existed for 11 months, employed 9 people, produced no known reports, and was dissolved in the spring of 1946. He follows the convoy as far as he can. It reaches the coast. There is a ship. The ship's log survives and lists cargo tonnage and a passenger count of 19 without a passenger list, which again should be impossible. The ship crosses the Atlantic in the summer of 1945 and docks in a port on the American East Coast. And there the trail stops completely, because whatever happened after the gangway was not written down in any document Callaway ever gets his hands on. But something else starts happening at almost exactly the same time, and it is happening in the open, and it is visible in the most mundane records imaginable. Construction contracts. Beginning in the autumn of 1945 and continuing through the following 2 years, 3 separate military installations in the American Southwest begin building underground laboratory space. This is unremarkable in itself. The country is building everything, everywhere. The post-war military construction program is one of the largest in history. What is remarkable is the specification. Callaway obtains the general contract documents for one of these projects, and he is not an engineer, so he takes them to a man who is a civil engineer he trusts, and he asks him one question: what is this for? The engineer looks at the drawings for a long time. Then he says, whoever ordered this is not worried about a bomb. He explains, the structure is not hardened the way blast shelters are hardened. The walls are thick, but the thickness is in the wrong places, and the reinforcement runs in the wrong direction for overpressure. There is no blast door geometry. There are no shock isolation mounts of the kind you would put under equipment you wanted to survive a nearby detonation. What there is copper, a continuous copper mesh embedded in the concrete of every wall, floor and ceiling of the main chamber, bonded to a ground system that runs down into bedrock. The engineer describes it as the most thorough electromagnetic shielding he has ever seen specified for anything, and he notes that it is designed the wrong way round. Shielding usually keeps interference out. This is grounded on the inside. It is built to keep something in. And there is one more thing, which the engineer points out last, almost as an afterthought, tapping the elevation drawing with the back of a pencil. The main chamber is square, roughly 11 metres by 11 metres. The ceiling is unusually high, and at the top of each of the 4 walls there is a heavy mounting plate, anchored into the structure, positioned at the corners of a square. Callaway does not say anything to the engineer. He thanks him and takes the drawings back and drives home and sits in his car outside his own house for a while with the engine off. He has just watched somebody rebuild Room 13 in the New Mexico desert. The name Camp Echo appears in exactly 4 documents that Callaway ever sees. It is never a formal designation. That is clear from the way it is used. It appears the way nicknames appear, in the margins of memoranda, and in a travel voucher, and once in a handwritten note attached to a supply requisition. And each time it is written as though the reader will obviously know what it means. The desert installations of the post-war American Southwest are famous now. White Sands, where the captured rockets were fired. Los Alamos, up in the mountains. Sandia, the proving grounds and the test ranges, an enormous archipelago of secret geography spread across land that was chosen because nobody lived there and nobody would notice. Camp Echo is inside that archipelago and is not part of it. It has its own perimeter within another perimeter. It has its own access list, and the access list is short enough that Callaway is eventually able to establish its approximate size. which is somewhere between 40 and 60 people including support staff. It has its own supply chain that does not route through the parent installation's quartermaster, which is administratively absurd and enormously expensive, and is the kind of thing you only do when you cannot allow a clerk in the next building to see what you're ordering. And its security classification, according to a comparative handling schedule Callaway sees exactly once, sits above the classification applied to nuclear weapons design information. Think about that for a moment, because it is the hinge of the entire story. In the late 1940s, the single most protected category of information in the United States was how to build an atomic bomb. That was the crown. That was the thing men were executed over. Everything in the American security system was built outward from that centre, and there is a compartment above it. Not larger, not more expensive, just higher, so that a man cleared to read bomb design documents would be turned away at the door of a building in the desert, containing 40 people and no weapons program at all. Meanwhile, 90 miles away, Werner von Braun is firing rockets into the sky. And this is the piece of the conspiracy that is, in a strange way, the most elegant part of it. The famous paperclip scientists were not in on it. They were genuinely rocket men, doing genuine rocket work, with genuine ambition. Von Braun spent those years doing exactly what he had always wanted to do, which was to build machines that leave the atmosphere, and he was extremely public about it. He wrote magazine articles, he appeared on television, he worked with a film studio to make programs about space travel that were watched by tens of millions of people. He was, by the middle of the 1950s, one of the most recognisable scientists in America. He was also, according to the conspiracy, the most effective piece of camouflage ever deployed by any government anywhere. Because here is what happened whenever a journalist began asking questions about Operation Paperclip. They asked about Nazis. They asked correctly and importantly how a country that had just fought a war against fascism could hand laboratories and salaries and citizenship to men who had worn the uniform of the enemy, some of whom had signed for prisoner labour. They asked about the whitewashed files. They asked about the softened security reports. There were editorials. There were letters. Rabbis and veterans organisations and members of Congress objected publicly and repeatedly, and that objection was real and justified, and it did not go away for decades. And every single one of those arguments took place on the surface of the programme. Nobody ever asked the other question. Nobody ever asked whether every scientist who came in under Paperclip was actually a scientist of the kind the programme said it was recruiting. Because why would you? The scandal was right there. Obvious, enormous, and morally serious, and it absorbed every ounce of scrutiny anyone had to give. The conspiracy's central claim is not that the government hid Operation Paperclip. It is that the government let the controversy happen, that the outrage was not a failure of secrecy, it was the cover. A public argument about the ethics of the visible programme is the single, most effective way to guarantee that nobody looks past it. And if you had wanted to design a distraction, you could not have designed a better one than a genuine moral scandal that the press could chew on for 40 years. Give them something real to be angry about. They will never ask what is behind it. The machine at Camp Echo comes back to life on a night in the winter of 1947. The account Callaway eventually assembles is thin and second-hand, and he is honest about that in his own notes. It comes from a maintenance electrician who worked at the parent installation, and who was called in, once, to deal with a problem at a facility he was not clear to enter, and who therefore stood in a corridor for 2 hours with a toolbox and no explanation and paid very close attention, because that is what people do when you leave them in a corridor. What the electrician remembers is this: the lights in the entire installation dimmed for a period he estimates at 11 or 12 seconds, not flickered, dimmed smoothly, and came back smoothly, the way lights do when something enormous is drawing load. Every compass in the building turned. He's specific about this because he was carrying one clipped to his belt, an ordinary field compass, and he watched the needle swing slowly through most of a full rotation and then settle, pointing at a wall. And afterward, the clocks were wrong, not all of them. The mechanical clocks, the wind-up ones, were fine. It was the electric clocks, the ones synchronized to the installation's own timing circuit, and every one of them was behind by the same amount, and the electrician knew the amount because his job for the next 4 hours was to walk the building resetting them. 47 seconds, every clock, the same 47 seconds. In a building where the power had not actually been interrupted, because the emergency lighting never triggered, and the refrigeration in the canteen never cycled, the electrician asked his supervisor about it the following week, and was told, in a friendly way, that he had not been there. Within a month, the classification level around Camp Echo goes up again. New access list, new handling caveat, a new code word that Calloway sees exactly twice in his life, and never once sees explained, and the men who work there stop leaving. That is documented in the mundane way that everything real is documented. Housing records. The married quarters at the parent installation lose 4 families who moved to on-site accommodation that did not exist 18 months earlier. School enrolment figures shift. A grocery contract triples. 40-some people and their families move inside a fence in the desert, and a number of them stay inside that fence for years. Whatever they were doing, they were not commuting to it. Dr. Samuel Richter contacts Calloway in the spring of 1986. By then, Calloway is 75 years old and has been retired for a very long time. The files he built over 4 decades fill most of a spare bedroom in a house in Virginia, organised with the same relentless clerical patience that started the whole thing, cross-referenced, indexed, and read by absolutely nobody. The letter is 1 page. It gives an address in Arizona and a time and says only that the writer knew a man named Kessler, which is the name of one of the 12, and that he is old and would like to stop carrying something. Calloway flies out the following week. Richter is 88. He is thin and precise and very tired, and he was, he explains, never one of the 12. He was younger, he was an American, a physicist recruited domestically in 1948, brought into Camp Echo as a junior man because somebody had decided that the program could not survive forever on a group of German émigrés who were all going to die eventually. He worked there for 19 years, and what he tells Calloway across 3 afternoons is not what Calloway spent 40 years expecting to hear. The Germans, Richter says, never built a weapon and never tried to. They also never built a doorway. That is the misunderstanding that Richter is most insistent about correcting, and he comes back to it repeatedly. Everyone assumes the machine did something, that it tore, or opened, or created. It did not. The apparatus in that mountain was, in engineering terms, almost boring. Coils, a resonant cavity, a very stable power supply, and an obsessive attention to geometric symmetry. It generated a field. That is all it did. The phenomenon it revealed was not made by the machine. It was already there. Richter describes it as best he can to a man who is not a physicist, like this. Imagine you have lived your whole life in a room lit by a single lamp, and you believe you can see everything in that room, because you can see everything the lamp illuminates. And one day somebody builds a device that changes the colour of the light, not brighter, just different. And in that different light you discover there has always been a second layer of markings on the walls, and there always was. And the only reason you never saw them is that your eyes and your lamp were never tuned to them. The machine was not a door. The machine was a change in the colour of the light, and what it revealed, according to Richter, was not another planet, and not another dimension, in the way the phrase is usually used in stories. It was, as far as anyone at Camp Echo could ever establish, another version of this same place, the same room, the same mountain, the same desert, occupied differently. Under stable field conditions, the two overlapped. For a short time, both were present in the same space, and neither had priority, and an observer in one could see into the other, and the experiments consistently, repeatedly, over 20 years, produced the same duration, 17 seconds. Nobody at Camp Echo ever understood why it was 17. Richter says that number was the great unsolved problem of his professional life, that they tried everything, more power, less power, different geometry, different materials, different times of year. and the answer was always the same. The overlap begins, 17 seconds pass, the overlap ends, and it ends on its own, regardless of what the operators do, which is the part that Richter says he found genuinely frightening in a way he could never explain to his own family. It ends on schedule, which means the duration is not being set by us. The last thing Richter tells him is the thing Calloway does not write down for 2 days. The German team, on the night of the 4th test, believed they were looking into an empty laboratory. That was the initial interpretation, and it is what the first report says. They saw a room that was recognisably their own room, and in it an object of unknown manufacture. They ran the 4th test twice more that autumn. On the 2nd of those runs, the object was there again, in the same position. On the 3rd, it was not. Instead, according to the account Richter received second-hand from Kessler in 1951, in a kitchen in New Mexico, there were figures. 3 of them, standing well back from the centre of the room near the wall, in a loose arrangement that Kessler described using a word that Richter repeated to Calloway carefully, because it was the specific word Kessler had used, and Richter did not want to soften it. Kessler said they were arranged the way people arrange themselves when they have been waiting for a while. They did not approach, they did not gesture, they did not appear surprised. For the full 17 seconds they remained where they were, and for the full 17 seconds, according to the observer at the periscope, they were looking directly into the mirror, which is not where a person would look. A person seeing a strange room appear around them would look at the room. These looked at the one point in that space where a human eye was, behind 3 meters of rock, through an angled mirror in a steel tube, and they held that look for 17 seconds, and then they were gone. The German team shut the program down that night, not paused it, shut it down. Richter says the order came from the facility director himself, on his own authority, without consulting anyone, and that within a week the team had begun the process of stopping, which is why the mountain looks the way it looks. They did not destroy anything, because they were not fleeing, they were closing. They put the tools on the pegboard and the plates in the rack, and they stripped room 13 down to the bedrock, and they took the floor with them, and then they waited for whoever was coming. And in April of 1945 the Americans came, and in August of 1945 the Americans switched it back on. There is a version of this story where that is the shocking part, and Richter does not think so. Richter says that any government on Earth would have done the same, and that if the Soviets had reached the mountain 9 hours earlier, there would have been a Camp Echo outside Sverdlovsk instead. And everything that followed would have followed anyway in a different language. He says the only thing that surprises him, looking back over 90 years, is how quickly it stopped being a discovery and started being a program. Discoveries have papers, programs have budgets. The moment it had a budget, he says, nobody was ever going to be told, sit with the shape of the cover-up for a moment, because it is more interesting than the usual shape. Most secrets are protected by denial. You hide the thing, and when somebody asks about it, you say it does not exist and you hope they go away. It works badly, and it never works for long, because denial creates a hole, and people are extremely good at noticing holes. The conspiracy's account of Operation Paperclip describes something much more sophisticated. It describes protecting a secret by giving the public a different secret. Consider what actually happened in the open. The program was classified at first, then partially revealed, then argued about for the rest of the century. Historians did excellent work. Journalists filed lawsuits. Documents came out in tranches across the 1970s and 80s and 90s, each release producing a fresh wave of coverage, and every single wave was about the same thing. Nazis, ethics, files that had been laundered, men who should have faced a tribunal and instead received a pension and a plaque. That is a genuine scandal. It deserved every word written about it, and it functioned, according to this story, as a permanent lightning rod. Any energy directed at Operation Paperclip went straight into that argument and ground it out there. Nobody ever got past it, because there was no reason to imagine there was anything past it. The visible outrage was so complete that it defined the entire shape of the subject. Calloway writes one paragraph about this in the notes he leaves behind, and it is the closest he ever comes to a thesis. He writes that a lie is a fragile thing, but a true scandal is a fortress, and that the men who ran Section Black understood something about human attention that took him 30 years to learn, which is that people do not stop digging when you tell them there is nothing there. They stop digging when they find something. Give them a body. They will stop looking for the room it came from. Meanwhile, the program itself does what programs do, which is that it stops being one thing and becomes many things. Camp Echo, as an entity, dissolves at some point in the 1950s. Calloway can never date it precisely because there is no dissolution order, only a gradual thinning of references and then silence. The site does not close. The people do not leave. What changes is the paperwork. What had been one compartment becomes several. The theoretical work goes to a study group with an innocuous name attached to a research office. The instrumentation development goes somewhere else, funded through a line item for advanced detection systems. The observational program keeps the site and acquires a code word that Calloway never learns. Later, in the 1960s, pieces of it appear to migrate again into agencies that did not exist when it started, under budget headings that are genuinely for other things and are large enough to hide a 40-person installation in the rounding. This is not exotic. This is exactly how long-lived classified work behaves, and anyone who has studied the history of secret programs will recognise the pattern immediately. Programs that last for decades do not survive by being hidden. They survive by being restructured, because a compartment that never changes eventually accumulates too many people who know it exists. You keep the work, you retire the name, and every time you retire a name you break the trail behind you, so that a researcher 40 years later finds 3 documents that appear to be about 3 unrelated activities and has no reason on earth to connect them. Calloway spends his last working decade trying to connect them, and he does it the only way available to him, which is by following money and buildings rather than words. Words change, concrete does not. A power line built in 1947 is still carrying current in 1979, and the substation upgrade that services it appears in a public utility filing, because utilities have to file. That is how he keeps the thread. Not through intelligence, through infrastructure. In 1978, 2 years before he retires, Calloway is granted access to a closing report. He never explains, in any of his notes, how. There is a gap in his personal record for the better part of a year around that time, and a reassignment to an office he had no business being in, and one can draw conclusions, or one can accept that a man who spent 40 years being unfailingly correct with paperwork had probably accumulated a great many small favours. The document is a summary. It is 11 pages. It is a wrap-up of the original Section Black activity, written in 1952, transferring residual responsibilities to successor programs, and it is written in the completely flat, bloodless register of institutional prose, which somehow makes it worse. 10.5 pages are administrative. Personnel dispositions, property transfers, records retention. The paragraph about the 12 German researchers uses the phrase, "Subjects have been afforded permanent residence under conditions of continuing programmatic association," which Calloway reads 3 times and understands perfectly, because it means they never left. It is the final paragraph that he copies out longhand and keeps in his wallet until the paper wears through at the folds. It consists of 2 sentences. Rocket technology justified the operation. The anomaly justified everything that followed. So here is the inversion, and it is worth saying plainly, because everything up to this point has been building toward it. The standard understanding of Operation Paperclip is that America wanted German scientists because German science was ahead. That is broadly true in specific fields in 1945. German rocketry was genuinely years beyond anything the Allies had. The engineering was real, and the men who did it were extraordinary at what they did, and it is not an exaggeration to say that the American space program of the 1960s was built on a foundation poured in Peenemünde. The conspiracy does not dispute any of that. It disputes the word why. Because if what you want is knowledge, you do not need the man. Knowledge is portable. Knowledge is in the drawings, the calculations, the wind tunnel data, the test films, the notebooks. The Allies captured all of it, by the ton, and in fact a great deal of German rocket technology was successfully reproduced by people who never met a German engineer in their lives. You take the man when the man is the only copy, and the men in Section Black were the only copy of something that was not written down anywhere, because the thing they had was not a technique or a theory or a design. It was an experience. 12 people, in a room under a mountain, watch 3 figures stand in an overlapping version of their own laboratory and look back at them for 17 seconds. There is no equation for that. There is no blueprint. There is nothing you can capture and ship home in a crate, because the entire value of those 12 men was that they were the only human beings alive who knew what it had actually looked like. The United States was not importing expertise. It was importing witnesses, and you do not let witnesses go home, which is the quiet, ugly, entirely plausible explanation for why 12 birth records were removed from bound volumes and 12 death certificates were never issued, and 2 men in good coats sat in a kitchen outside Hamburg in 1949 and told an old woman that they were not able to answer whether her brother was alive. Not that he had died, that they were not able to say, which is a very different sentence, and she heard the difference, and she thought about it for the rest of her life. The last piece of the story is contemporary, and it is the part that anyone can check, which is either reassuring or not, depending on how you feel by the end of it. A physicist working with declassified Cold War material notices something odd about a stretch of desert. She's not looking for any of this. She's doing energy history, mapping the electrical infrastructure of the American Southwest across the 20th century, which is the kind of work that sounds tedious and turns out to be full of ghosts, because power lines are honest. A building can be demolished. A program can be renamed. But if something is drawing current, somebody is generating and metering that current, and it appears in a filing. There is a substation in a valley inside a restricted area, built in 1946, upgraded in 1958, upgraded again in 1971, and again in the 1990s. It has never been decommissioned. The facility it serves has not appeared in a public installation inventory since the 1950s. Satellite imagery, which is available to anyone with an internet connection, shows a compound of perhaps a dozen structures, a paved apron, vehicle tracks that are freshly disturbed, and roof-mounted equipment that has been replaced at least twice in the last 20 years. Somebody maintains that place. And the load data, which is aggregated and coarse, and not supposed to reveal anything about any individual customer, does something curious. Every so often, at irregular intervals of a few months, there is a spike. It is enormous relative to the baseline. It is extremely brief, and when the physicist pulls the highest resolution data available to her, which is not very high, and looks at the shape of it, the spike has a plateau, a rise, a flat top, a fall, and the plateau, within the limits of what the data can tell her, is 17 seconds long. She has written about it once, in a paper that is mostly about something else, in a footnote, in careful language, noting an anomalous periodic load event at an unidentified facility, and observing that the duration is unusually consistent. Nobody has ever responded to the footnote, which means one of two things, and the story leaves you to sit with both. Either there is a piece of Cold War equipment out in that desert that has been running on a maintenance cycle for 80 years because nobody has the authority to sign the order to turn it off, or somebody is still watching, and every few months for exactly 17 seconds, the light changes colour, and a room becomes 2 rooms, and whoever is standing in that chamber looks across at a version of the same desert, and whatever is standing on the other side has now had 80 years to get used to the schedule. Thomas Calloway dies in 1994, at 83, in Virginia in the winter. He dies believing that he failed, and by any reasonable measure he did. He never proved anything. He never published anything. He never told a journalist because he had spent his life inside a system that he still on some level believed in, and because the one time he came close he thought about the 12 names, and what had happened to the people who possessed inconvenient knowledge. And he had a daughter, and he did not do it. What he leaves is a spare bedroom full of paper. His daughter puts it in storage because she cannot face it. It sits there for 11 years. Eventually his granddaughter, who was at that point in her 30s and never really knew him, drives out to a storage unit outside Richmond to clear it, expecting to spend a weekend in a dumpster. She spends 4 months. At the bottom of a footlocker, under a folded uniform and a set of maps and a bundle of letters, there is a plain envelope with nothing written on it. Inside is one photograph. It is small, and it has been handled a great deal, and it is a contact print of the kind made in a facility darkroom rather than a commercial one. It shows a concrete room with a low ceiling and a machine at the back, a lattice of copper coil and welded frame, and in front of it 6 men in laboratory coats, arranged in the awkward line of people who have been told to stand together for a picture they do not particularly want taken. Their faces are calm. 2 of them are almost smiling. On the back, in pencil, is a date in April of 1945, and nothing else. The granddaughter looks at it for a long time and does not see it, and almost puts it back. What makes her look again is the light. There is a polished steel panel on the wall behind the group, part of a cabinet, and it is acting as a mirror the way steel does, dark and imperfect, holding a soft reflection of the room. She can see the back of the photographer's head in it, and the tripod, and the doorway behind him, and she can see something standing in the corner of the room, behind and to the left of the 6 men. It is not in the room. That is the thing that takes her a while to understand, and once she understands it, she cannot stop understanding it. The 6 men are lit from the front by the flash, and their shadows fall backward, and the figure in the reflection casts no shadow at all, and is not standing in the place where the reflection says it should be if it were a 7th person who had wandered into the shot. It is very tall, taller than the doorframe beside it, by a clear margin. It is dark and regular in outline, and there is nothing about it that suggests equipment. And its head is turned toward the camera, not toward the men, not toward the machine, toward the lens directly, in a photograph taken in a moment when the machine was switched off, in a room where every human being present is looking somewhere else. She turns the print over again and holds it under the lamp, and this time she sees that the pencil on the back is not just a date. Beneath the date, very faint, pressed lightly, in a different hand, there are 6 words. It knew we were watching first. So that is the story. History remembers Operation Paperclip as a race. America against the Soviet Union, across a broken Germany, for the men who knew how to make things fly. And in the version we're told, America won, and the prize was a Saturn rocket and a footprint on the moon, and a set of moral compromises that the country has been arguing about ever since. According to the conspiracy, the race was never about rockets. It was about reaching 12 men before anyone else did. 12 quiet academics who had spent 2 years in a mountain trying to measure something too small to matter, and who had accidentally changed the colour of the light, and who had looked through into a room that was their room and was not, and had seen 3 shapes standing near the wall in the posture of people who had been waiting a while. They were not brought to America for what they could build. They were brought to America for what they had seen. And the last thing worth saying before you drift off is the thing the whole story quietly rests on. Every version of this account assumes that we were the ones who opened something. The photograph suggests otherwise. The photograph was taken before the 4th test, before the field ever stabilised, before anyone in that mountain had the faintest idea there was anything to see. And the figure in the reflection was already there, and it was already looking at the camera, which means the door did not open in 1944. It means that in 1944, for the first time, somebody on this side noticed it was already open, and that something on the other side had been standing at it, patiently, for a very long time, watching a room full of men who could not see it, and waiting for one of them to finally get the equipment right. The world believes Operation Paperclip changed history because it gave America the scientists who reached the moon. According to the conspiracy, It changed history because it brought home 12 men who discovered that humanity had never been alone in its own reality,